Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a Christmas you have never known. Picture this. It is 1843. Charles Dickens publishes A Christmas Carol. The world falls in love with the idea of a perfect magical Christmas. Families gathered around the tree. Snow falling gently outside. Warmth, love, and generosity filling every heart. But here is what nobody tells you. It was all a beautiful lie. The real Victorian Christmas. It was darker than any ghost story Dickens ever wrote. Children were dying in chimneys, families were torn apart in workhouses, and the holiday we celebrate today was born from one of the most brilliant acts of propaganda in history. Now, before we step into the gaslit streets of Victorian England together, I need to ask you something. If you find yourself pulled into this story, if something I share tonight makes you see Christmas differently, would you take just a moment to subscribe to this channel? Maybe hit that like button or share this with someone who loves history as much as you do. And I am genuinely curious. Where are you right now? Are you tucked into bed in California? Sitting in a cozy chair in London? Wherever you are, drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and I love knowing there is someone out there listening to these stories with me. All right, get comfortable. Maybe dim those lights a little. Let the room settle into that quiet space where stories come alive. And let us walk together into the winter of 1843. You know, we all think we know Victorian Christmas, do we not? We picture it like a Hallmark card. The warm glow of candlelight through frosted windows, the smell of roasted goose and plum pudding, children in their best clothes, eyes shining with excitement. Charles Dickens gave us that vision in A Christmas Carol, and honestly, it is beautiful. But here is what keeps me up at night, what made me dive deep into this research. That beautiful vision was not a description of reality. It was a desperate wish for what Christmas could be, written by a man who had seen the absolute worst of what it actually was. Let me take you back to Dickens himself for a moment. When Charles Dickens was 12 years old, his father was thrown into debtor's prison, and young Charles, just a child, was sent to work in a blacking factory. Do you know what that means? Picture a 12-year-old boy standing for 12 hours a day, pasting labels onto bottles of shoe polish. His hands black with grime, his stomach empty, his childhood stolen. This was not some dramatic story he made up. This was his life, and it was the life of hundreds of thousands of children across England. So when Dickens sat down to write A Christmas Carol in the autumn of 1843, he was not writing fiction. He was writing a dream, a vision of what he wished Christmas could be. The problem is, we forgot it was a dream. We started thinking it was real. Here is what Christmas actually looked like before Dickens rewrote it in our collective imagination. In the early 1800s, Christmas was barely celebrated at all. I know that sounds shocking, but it is true. For most working people, December 25th was just another day. You woke up, you went to work, you came home exhausted. There were no Christmas trees in homes, no cards in the mail, no Santa Claus coming down chimneys, and definitely no paid time off. The wealthy, sure, they might have a feast. They might exchange small gifts. But for the vast majority of people living in Victorian England, Christmas meant nothing. Or worse, it meant something dark that nobody wanted to face. Let me paint you a picture of London in the 1840s. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing. Factories are spreading across the city like a disease. The air is thick with coal smoke. The Thames River is basically an open sewer, black and toxic, and people are flooding in from the countryside, desperate for work, any work, because the old agricultural jobs are disappearing. These people end up living in slums. And I do not mean poor neighborhoods, I mean slums. Entire families crammed into a single room. No running water, no sanitation. Diseases like cholera and typhoid sweeping through like wildfire. The infant mortality rate in some parts of London was over 50%. Think about that. More than half of all babies born did not live to see their 5th birthday. And this is the world Charles Dickens knew. This is what he saw every day when he walked through the streets of London. Now here is where it gets really interesting. Dickens did not just want to write a ghost story. He wanted to write something that would wake people up. He wanted to grab them by the shoulders and force them to see what was happening all around them. So he created Ebenezer Scrooge, a man who represents everything that was wrong with Victorian society. Cold, calculating, obsessed with profit, blind to human suffering. And then Dickens does something genius. He shows us what Scrooge could become. He shows us that even the hardest heart can change. That generosity and compassion are possible. That Christmas could be a time when the rich remember the poor, when families come together, when we choose love over greed. It is beautiful. It is hopeful. And it worked. A Christmas Carol became a sensation. It sold out its first printing in just 5 days. Everybody was reading it. Everybody was talking about it. And slowly, gradually, the idea of Christmas began to change. But here is what bothers me, what I think we need to talk about. The Christmas Dickens described in his book, the Christmas we still celebrate today, was not the Christmas that actually existed. It was the Christmas he wanted to create. And there is nothing wrong with that except we forgot it was aspirational. We started thinking the Victorians actually celebrated Christmas the way Dickens described it. They did not. Let me tell you what was really happening on Christmas Day in 1843, the same year A Christmas Carol was published. While Dickens was writing about the Cratchit family gathering around their modest but loving Christmas dinner, do you know what was actually happening in the workhouses across England? Families were being torn apart. Husbands separated from wives, mothers separated from children, because that is how the workhouse system worked. You could not stay together. The law would not allow it. So on Christmas Day, while the wealthy were feasting on roast beef and plum pudding, thousands of poor families were eating watery gruel in separate rooms, not even allowed to see each other. Children as young as 5 were working in factories, 12, 14, 16 hours a day, on Christmas, because there were no labour laws protecting them, no minimum age requirements, no safety regulations. If a child died in a factory accident, the factory owner might have to pay a small fine. Might. Usually they did not even have to do that. And then there were the chimney sweeps. Oh, we need to talk about the chimney sweeps. You know how in Mary Poppins, Bert dances on the rooftop singing about being a chimney sweep? It is charming, right? Romantic even. The real chimney sweeps were children, sometimes as young as 3 or 4 years old, and they did not dance on rooftops. They climbed up inside chimneys, narrow, dark, suffocating chimneys, often while the chimney was still warm from the fire, sometimes while it was still burning. Do you know what happened to these children? Their arms and legs would be scraped raw from climbing. Their lungs would be filled with soot. Many of them developed cancer from the constant exposure to carcinogens. And Christmas was their busiest season. Because every wealthy household wanted their chimneys cleaned before the holiday festivities began. So while Dickens was writing about the Christmas spirit, real children were being sent up burning chimneys. While he was describing Tiny Tim and his hopeful innocence, real children were dying of neglect and abuse. Now, I am not telling you this to ruin Christmas. I promise I am not. But I think it is important that we understand what was really happening. Because when we romanticize the Victorian era, when we talk about how beautiful and elegant it was, we erase the suffering of millions of people. Dickens knew this. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was not trying to describe reality, he was trying to change it. He was holding up a mirror and saying, look at what we could be, look at what we should be. And in many ways, it worked. After A Christmas Carol was published, attitudes toward Christmas did start to change. Employers started giving workers the day off. Families started gathering together. The tradition of gift-giving spread from the wealthy to the middle class and eventually to working families. But it took decades, generations even, and meanwhile the suffering continued. I think about this a lot, about how we create myths to comfort ourselves, how we tell stories about the past that make us feel better about the present. The Victorian Christmas we imagine, with its snow-covered streets and carolers and perfect family gatherings, it is a story we tell ourselves. It is a story Dickens started, and we've been retelling it ever since. But underneath that story there is another one, a darker one, a more complicated one. And that is the story I want to explore with you tonight. Because here is the thing. The Victorian era was not just one thing. It was not just workhouses and child labour and poverty. But it was not just elegant dresses and Christmas trees and Dickens novels either. It was both. It was a time of incredible progress and unbelievable cruelty existing side by side. The same society that invented the Christmas card also allowed children to work themselves to death. The same people who decorated Christmas trees also turned a blind eye to families starving in the streets. The same culture that gave us the image of Father Christmas also created a system where being poor was treated like a crime. And Dickens understood this contradiction. That is why A Christmas Carol is such a powerful story. Because Scrooge is not just one man. Scrooge is Victorian England, cold and calculating on the outside, but capable of transformation, capable of choosing compassion over cruelty. The question is, did Victorian society actually transform? Did the beautiful Christmas Dickens imagined ever really come true? Or did we just get better at hiding the darkness underneath? That is what we're going to find out together. Over the next hours, we're going to peel back the layers of Victorian Christmas. We're going to look at the traditions, the food, the decorations, the games. But we're also going to look at what was happening behind closed doors, in the workhouses, in the factories, in the narrow, suffocating chimneys of London's wealthiest homes. We're going to discover a Christmas that was far stranger, far darker, and far more complicated than anything you learned in school. A Christmas where ghost stories were more popular than carols, where children played games involving bowls of flaming alcohol, where Christmas cards featured dead birds and surreal nightmarish imagery. This is not the Christmas you think you know. This is the Christmas that actually was. But before we dive into the specifics, before we talk about the workhouses and the traditions and all the bizarre customs, there is something else we need to understand. Something that sits at the very heart of Victorian Christmas. Something that shaped everything else. You see, while the wealthy were decorating their homes and planning their feasts, while Dickens was writing his novels and middle-class families were starting to adopt these new traditions, there was an entire population of people for whom Christmas meant something very different, something much darker. In the next part, we're going to walk through the doors of a Victorian workhouse on Christmas Day, and I have to warn you, what we are about to see is going to change the way you think about this holiday forever. Stay with me. So imagine standing at the gates of a Victorian workhouse on Christmas morning in 1840. The year is cold, bitterly cold, and you're about to walk through those doors because you have nowhere else to go. Maybe you lost your job when the factory closed. Maybe your husband died and left you with 4 children to feed. Maybe you're just too old, too sick, too broken to work anymore. Whatever the reason, you have come to the one place nobody wants to go. The place people whisper about with fear. The place they call, simply, the workhouse. Now, before we step inside, I want you to think about something. What does Christmas mean to you? Is it family gathered around a table? Is it warmth and laughter and the smell of good food cooking? Is it that feeling of being loved, of belonging somewhere? Hold that image in your mind. Because what I am about to show you is the opposite of everything you just pictured. The first thing that happens when you arrive at the workhouse is this. They strip you, literally. You walk through the door and they take away your clothes. Every single piece. Your coat, your dress, your shoes, even your undergarments. Everything you own, everything that makes you you, gets taken away and often burned. They say it is for hygiene, to prevent disease. And maybe that is partly true, but it is also about something else. It is about breaking you down, about making you understand that you're no longer a person with dignity and rights. You're now a pauper, a burden on society. Then they give you a uniform, a rough, coarse uniform made of the cheapest material they could find. It scratches your skin. It is the same uniform everyone else wears. Men, women, children, all dressed exactly the same, all looking exactly the same, and you are expected to wear this uniform for the entire time you are here, whether that is 2 days, 2 weeks, or 2 years. When it wears out, when it falls apart from overuse, well, that is your problem. But here is the part that breaks my heart. Here is the part that I think about late at night when I cannot sleep. After they strip you and dress you in that uniform, they separate you from your family. Husbands go to one ward, wives to another. Children over the age of 7 get taken away from their mothers and put in the children's ward. And you are not allowed to see each other, not allowed to talk, not allowed to touch. Can you imagine? Can you imagine being a mother and having your child, your baby, torn from your arms on Christmas Day? Can you imagine being married for 50 years and being told you cannot hold your wife's hand, cannot sit beside your husband, cannot even look at each other across a room? This was the law. This was how the workhouse system worked. And it was all based on a theory. A terrible, cruel theory that poverty was a moral failing. That if you were poor, it was because you were lazy or drunk or somehow deficient as a human being. And therefore, receiving help had to be so unpleasant, so degrading, that you would do anything to avoid it. The architects of the New Poor Law in 1834 had a term for this. They called it less eligibility. The idea was simple. Life in the workhouse had to be worse than life outside the workhouse, even for the poorest labourer. Otherwise, they reasoned, people would just choose to live in workhouses instead of working. They would become dependent on charity. They would lose their motivation to support themselves. So they made the workhouses as horrible as possible on purpose. The food was deliberately bad. The work was deliberately hard. The rules were deliberately harsh. All of it designed to make you so miserable that you would rather starve on the streets than ask for help. And Christmas was no exception. In 1840, the Morning Chronicle newspaper did something fascinating. They sent reporters to workhouses all across London to find out what the inmates would be eating on Christmas Day. And what they discovered was shocking, even by the standards of that time. Let me tell you about St Marylebone Workhouse. On Christmas Day 1840, this workhouse held 1,661 people. Think about that number for a moment. 1,661 human beings, all locked away in one building. Families torn apart, children crying for their mothers, old couples separated after decades of marriage. And what did these people get for Christmas dinner? 6 ounces of roast beef. That is less than half the size of a normal steak you might order at a restaurant today. 1 pound of potatoes, 1 pound of plum pudding, 1 pint of porter, which is a type of beer, and for the men 1 ounce of tobacco, for the women a bit of snuff. Now you might be thinking, well, that does not sound too bad, does it? Roast beef and plum pudding on Christmas. That sounds almost festive. But here is what you need to understand. For the other 364 days of the year, these people were eating watery gruel and stale bread. They were working 10-12 hours a day at backbreaking labour. They were living in crowded dormitories with no privacy, no comfort, no hope. And on Christmas Day, the one day of the year that is supposed to be about generosity and compassion, they got 6 ounces of beef. 6 ounces, and even that was controversial. Because officially, according to the Poor Law Commission, workhouses were not supposed to give out any special food on Christmas. No roast beef, no plum pudding, nothing. Christmas was supposed to be treated just like any other day. The reasoning was that if you gave inmates special food on holidays, it would create expectations. It would make them feel entitled. It would cost money that could be better spent elsewhere. But some workhouse managers ignored these rules. They felt that even the poorest people deserved something special on Christmas. So they found ways around the regulations. They accepted donations from wealthy benefactors. They had inmates save up their weekly meat ration so they could have a slightly bigger portion on Christmas Day. And you know what the ironic part is? These small acts of kindness, these tiny gestures of humanity, became propaganda for the workhouse system. Newspapers would write glowing reports about how well the poor were being treated, how generous the guardians were, how the workhouse Christmas was actually quite pleasant. There was even a tradition where the guardians and their wives would come to the workhouse on Christmas Day. They would dress in their finest clothes, fur coats, expensive hats, jewellery, and they would stand there, watching the inmates eat their meagre Christmas dinner, smiling, patting themselves on the back for their charity, making speeches about the spirit of Christmas. Can you imagine how that must have felt? To be sitting there in your rough uniform, eating your 6 ounces of beef, while wealthy people in furs stood over you, congratulating themselves for their generosity, while your children sat in another room, alone, because the law said families had to be separated. There is a poem about this, a famous poem written in 1877 by a journalist named George Robert Sims. It is called Christmas Day in the Workhouse, and it became one of the most popular pieces of Victorian literature. Let me tell you the story it tells. It is Christmas Day in the workhouse. The walls are decorated with holly and garlands to make things look festive. The inmates are sitting at long tables, clean-faced and quiet, about to eat their Christmas dinner. And the guardians and their ladies have come to watch, dressed in their warm winter clothes, smiling and putting pudding on pauper plates. Then one old man stands up. His name is John. He is from Devon. And he starts to shout. He pushes his plate away and cries out to God, saying the food chokes him. He cannot eat it. He will not eat it. The guardians are shocked. The master thinks the old man is drunk or mad, but John is neither. He is haunted, and he tells them why. Last Christmas, he says, my wife Nance was starving. We had no food, no money. For the first time in our lives, we needed help. So I came to this workhouse. I begged for food, and do you know what they told me? They said we could not have food unless we came inside, unless we entered the workhouse, unless we agreed to be separated. My wife and I had been married for 50 years. 50 years. We had never spent a single Christmas apart, and she said no. She said she would rather die than be separated from me on Christmas Day. She refused to come in, so I left. I went back to our tiny freezing room, and I tried to find food for her. I fought with a dog in the street over a crust of bread. I begged. I searched through garbage, but by the time I got back it was too late. She was dead, lying there in the moonlight, cold and still. She had called my name, the old man says. She had died alone, calling for me, while I was out desperately trying to find help. Help that could have saved her, if only we'd been willing to be torn apart. And now, 1 year later, The guardians want him to sit here and eat their Christmas dinner. They want him to smile and be grateful. They want him to pretend that everything is fine. He will not do it. He cannot do it. Now I need to tell you something important. This poem was not entirely accurate. George Robert Sims was a journalist, not a historian. He exaggerated some details for dramatic effect. The poor law actually did allow old couples to stay together in most cases. An emergency food relief was sometimes available without entering the workhouse. But here is the thing. The poem became wildly popular. It sold over 100,000 copies in its first year. People performed it in music halls all across England. It was recited at gatherings and printed in newspapers. Why? Because even if the specific details were not always accurate, the emotional truth was real. People knew what was happening in workhouses. They knew families were being separated. They knew children were suffering. They knew the system was cruel. And this poem gave voice to their anger and their guilt. Because that is what I find so fascinating about Victorian Christmas. There was this huge gap between what people wanted to believe and what was actually true. They wanted to believe in Dickens's vision of Christmas, the perfect family gathered around the fire, generosity and warmth and love. But at the same time, they were creating and supporting a system that did the exact opposite. Think about it. The same society that was buying Christmas cards and decorating Christmas trees was also locking poor families in workhouses and separating children from their parents. The same people who were reading A Christmas Carol and crying over Tiny Tim's struggles were voting for laws that made life harder for real children just like him. How do you hold those two things in your mind at once? How do you reconcile the beautiful myth with the ugly reality? I think what happened is this. The myth became a kind of shield. If you could focus on the perfect Christmas, if you could tell yourself that you were generous and kind because you gave the workhouse inmates 6 ounces of beef, then you did not have to think about the bigger questions. You did not have to ask why people were in workhouses in the first place. You did not have to question whether the entire system was fundamentally wrong. The Christmas decorations in the workhouse, those garlands of holly that George Robert Sims described in his poem, they were not really for the inmates. They were for the guardians. They were so the wealthy people who ran the system could come on Christmas Day and feel good about themselves. Look how festive we made it. Look how generous we are. Look how we have not forgotten the poor. But the inmates knew the truth. They knew those decorations would come down on December 26th. They knew the normal routine would resume, the same bad food, the same hard work, the same separation from their loved ones. The decorations were just a performance, a way for society to convince itself that it had a conscience. And the saddest part? Many of the people in those workhouses on Christmas Day were not lazy or drunk or morally deficient. They were just unlucky. They had gotten sick and could not work. Their spouse had died and left them with no income. The factory they worked at had closed down. The economy had shifted and their skills were no longer needed. In other words, they were victims of circumstance. But the Victorian worldview could not accept that. It had to believe that poverty was the poor's own fault. Because if poverty was not their fault, if it was just bad luck or systemic problems, then society would have to actually change things. And change is hard. Change is expensive. Change requires admitting you were wrong. So instead, they built workhouses. They created a system that punished people for being poor. And then, on Christmas Day, they hung up some holly and told themselves they were being charitable. I wonder what would have happened if Charles Dickens had written a different version of A Christmas Carol. What if instead of Scrooge visiting the Cratchit family's cosy home, he had visited a workhouse? What if he had seen the mothers separated from their children? The old couples torn apart after a lifetime together? What if he had watched the guardians in their furs smiling and self-satisfied, while the inmates choked down their 6 ounces of beef? Would that have changed anything? Or would people have found it too uncomfortable? too challenging, too real? We will never know. Because Dickens chose to write about the Christmas he wished existed, not the Christmas that actually did. And maybe that was the right choice. Maybe we needed that beautiful vision to inspire us to be better. But we also need to remember what that vision was covering up. We need to remember the price that real people paid while society was busy congratulating itself on its Christmas spirit. So now you know what Christmas in the Victorian workhouse was really like. The stripped dignity, the torn families, the empty gestures masquerading as generosity, the 6 ounces of beef presented as a feast. This was not the Christmas of Dickens' novels and greeting cards. This was the Christmas nobody wanted to talk about. The Christmas that happened behind closed doors while carolers sang in the streets outside. But the workhouse was only one piece of this story. Because while poor families were being locked away and separated, while children were crying for their mothers and old couples were dying alone, something else was happening, something stranger, something that might surprise you even more than what we've already discussed. You see, the Victorians had a tradition that seems completely bizarre to us now. A tradition that had nothing to do with generosity or family, or any of the things we associate with Christmas today. In the next part, we're going to explore how the Victorians turned Christmas into the season of ghosts and terror. We're going to discover why telling scary stories by the fire was more popular than singing carols. And we're going to meet a creature from German folklore that Victorian children both feared and strangely loved. The Christmas you think you know is about to get even stranger. Stay with me. There is something magical about sitting in a dark room with only the firelight flickering on the walls, is there not? Maybe you've done this yourself. Maybe on a camping trip, or during a power outage, or just for fun on a winter evening. There is something about darkness and firelight that makes you want to tell stories. And not just any stories. Scary stories. Ghost stories. Stories that make your skin prickle and your heart beat a little faster. Now, quick question for you. When do you think is the best time of year to tell ghost stories? If you said Halloween, you would be thinking like a modern person. But if you were a Victorian, you would say Christmas, without hesitation. Christmas was the season of ghosts. I know that sounds bizarre. Christmas is supposed to be about joy and family and presents and cookies, right? But for the Victorians, Christmas Eve was the night when you gathered around the fire and scared each other half to death with tales of supernatural terror. It was as much a part of the holiday tradition as decorating a tree or singing carols. Maybe more so. Let me share something that perfectly captures this tradition. In 1891, a British writer named Jerome K. Jerome published a collection of stories called Told After Supper, and in the introduction he wrote this: "Nothing satisfies us on Christmas Eve but to hear each other tell authentic anecdotes about spectres. It is a genial, festive season, and we love to muse upon graves and dead bodies and murders and blood." Read that again. "It is a genial, festive season, and we love to muse upon graves and dead bodies and murders and blood." That is what Christmas meant to a Victorian. Not sugar plums and reindeer, graves and murders. Why? What was it about Christmas that made the Victorians want to terrify each other? Well, part of it goes back much further than the Victorian era. Long before Christianity, long before Christmas even existed, the winter solstice was considered a thin time, a liminal time. You know what liminal means? It means a threshold, an in-between place. And in folklore, liminal times and places are when the barrier between our world and the spirit world becomes thin and permeable. Think about it. The winter solstice is the longest night of the year, the darkest night. The sun is at its weakest point. In ancient times, people genuinely did not know if the sun would come back, if spring would ever return. Winter was death, cold and darkness and hunger and loss. And when you are surrounded by death, when half the children in your village die before they turn 5, when people freeze to death in the streets, death stops being something distant and scary. It becomes familiar, almost like a neighbour you have learned to live beside. So the Victorians inherited this very old tradition of telling ghost stories during the darkest part of the year. But they took it and ran with it in ways that would make your head spin. You see, in the 1800s, something remarkable was happening. The Industrial Revolution was bringing incredible technological progress. Steam engines, factories, railways, telegraphs. The whole world was being transformed by science and machinery. And at the exact same time, the Victorians became absolutely obsessed with the supernatural. Does that seem contradictory to you? It did to them too. And that tension, that conflict between science and spiritualism, between progress and mystery, between what we can prove and what we can feel, that tension is what made Victorian ghost stories so powerful. They were living in a time when anything seemed possible. Scientists were discovering new species, mapping unknown continents, explaining how the universe worked. But people were also dying young from diseases nobody understood. Women were dying in childbirth. Children were dying of scarlet fever and typhoid and consumption. Death was everywhere, and science could not stop it. So people turned to spiritualism. They held seances. They tried to photograph ghosts. They formed societies dedicated to proving that the dead could communicate with the living, and they told ghost stories. Thousands and thousands of ghost stories. Here is something that will blow your mind. Historians estimate that between 50 and 70% of all ghost stories written in the 19th century were written by women. Women, not men. Women were the queens of Victorian supernatural fiction. Authors like Elizabeth Gaskell, Margaret Oliphant, Amelia Edwards. They wrote stories that could freeze your blood. And these stories were not published in obscure journals that nobody read. They were published in mainstream magazines, popular magazines that families subscribed to and read together. And do you know when these magazines release special ghost story editions? Christmas. Every single year. Christmas was ghost story season. Charles Dickens, who we talked about earlier, he understood this perfectly. When A Christmas Carol was first published in 1843, do you know what the full title was? It was not just a Christmas carol, it was a Christmas carol in prose, being a ghost story of Christmas. A ghost story of Christmas. That is how Dickens himself described it. And A Christmas Carol was just the beginning. Dickens went on to edit magazines that published special Christmas issues filled with ghost stories every year, like clockwork. He even said that Christmas Eve was the witching time for storytelling. The witching time. Like Halloween, except better, because it was darker and colder and more intimate. Can you imagine? Can you imagine sitting in your Victorian parlour on Christmas Eve, the fire crackling, candles providing the only light, and your father or uncle or older brother starts telling a story about a woman in white who appears on the moors, or a ghost ship that sails into harbour on Christmas night, or a dead man who knocks on the door asking to be let in from the cold. The darkness outside was real. Before electricity, before streetlights, the winter night was absolutely, utterly black. When you looked out your window on Christmas Eve, you could not see anything. Just darkness. And in that darkness, anything could be waiting. Anything could be real. That is why these stories worked so well. They were not separate from reality. They were mixed into it. The ghost story you heard tonight might be about something that supposedly happened in the village down the road. About a real person, or at least a person people claimed was real. About a house you could walk to if you wanted, if you dared. And here is the thing that I find most interesting. These ghost stories were not necessarily meant to be terrifying in the way modern horror movies are. They were meant to be unsettling, melancholy, thoughtful. They made you think about death and loss and what happens after we die. They made you appreciate being alive and safe and warm while there was still time. In a way, they were the perfect Christmas tradition. Because Christmas, real Christmas, the kind Dickens was writing about, was not about being happy all the time. It was about being grateful, about remembering that life is short and precious, about choosing to be generous and kind because someday, maybe sooner than you think, you will be the ghost in someone else's story. But ghost stories were not the only strange thing about Victorian Christmas. Oh no! The Victorians had another tradition that I need to tell you about, one that perfectly captures how weird and dark and wonderful they could be. They sent each other the most bizarre Christmas cards you've ever seen. You know what a Christmas card looks like today, right? Maybe a snowy scene, a Christmas tree, Santa Claus, a cute reindeer, maybe a Bible verse or a cheerful greeting. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Peace on Earth. Victorian Christmas cards. Dead birds. That is right. Dead birds. Specifically dead robins frozen in the snow. And the message on the card would say something like, "May yours be a joyful Christmas." I am not making this up. This was a real popular design. Or how about this one? A frog, stabbing another frog with a knife, while a third frog rifles through the victim's pockets stealing his belongings, and the caption says, "A hearty Christmas to you all." Or this, giant insects, beetles and grasshoppers the size of humans dressed in Victorian clothing, dancing together at what appears to be a Christmas ball. Or this, vegetables with human faces, turnips and potatoes with arms and legs, wearing hats, going about their business like normal people. And then there was Krampus. Oh, Krampus. Have you heard of Krampus? He is this creature from German and Alpine folklore, half goat, half demon, with horns and a long tongue and chains and a basket on his back, and his job, to punish naughty children. According to the legend, St. Nicholas would visit the good children and bring them gifts. But Krampus came with him to deal with the bad children. And what did Krampus do? He beat them with sticks. He kidnapped them. He stuffed them into his basket and carried them away. To where? The stories do not always say, but nowhere good. And the Victorians loved this. They put Krampus on Christmas cards. Cards showing him grabbing screaming children and shoving them into sacks. Cards showing him with his tongue hanging out, leering at terrified kids. And these cards would have messages like, "Greetings from Krampus," or sometimes just, "A Merry Christmas." Can you imagine sending that to your cousin? "Merry Christmas. Here is a picture of a demon kidnapping children." And it was not just Krampus. Santa Claus himself appeared on Victorian Christmas cards doing very un-Santa-like things, peeping through windows, spying on children like some kind of stalker, creeping down chimneys with this sinister expression on his face. In one card, Santa is literally stuffing a child into his sack of presents, while the child screams in terror. Why? Why did the Victorians create these nightmare-fuel Christmas cards? Well, there are a few theories. One is that the Victorians simply had a different sense of humour than we do. They found dark, morbid things funny in a way that makes us deeply uncomfortable now. Death was so common in their daily lives that they could joke about it. They could send each other cards featuring dead birds because death was not shocking or taboo. It was just life. Another theory is that these cards were meant to be conversation starters. You did not send someone a boring card with a generic message. You sent them something bizarre, something that would make them gasp or laugh or shake their head in disbelief. Something they would show to other people and talk about, the Victorian equivalent of a viral meme. And some of the imagery had deeper meanings that we have lost. The dead robin, for example, was actually a symbol of the poor children who froze to death in the streets every winter. It was meant to evoke sympathy, to remind wealthy Victorians that while they were warm and comfortable, children were dying of cold. It was social commentary disguised as a Christmas greeting. The frogs stabbing each other? Some scholars think that had to do with resurrection symbolism. There was an old belief that frogs died in winter and were reborn in spring, so they represented the cycle of death and renewal that was central to Christian theology. The vegetables with human faces? Nobody's entirely sure about that one. Maybe it was just for fun. But here is what I love about all of this. The Victorians did not separate the dark from the light. They did not say, "Oh, Christmas is only for happy things, let us never mention death or ghosts or fear or sadness." They understood that life is complicated, that joy and sorrow exist together, that you can celebrate the birth of Christ while also thinking about death, that you can feel grateful for your family while also acknowledging that someday you will lose them. Their Christmas was big enough to hold all of it, the beautiful and the grotesque, the sacred and the silly, the cozy firelight and the terrifying darkness outside. And I think there is something we've lost in our modern sanitized version of Christmas. We've made it so relentlessly cheerful, so determinedly happy, that there is no room for anything real anymore. No room for grief or fear or melancholy or death. We pretend those things do not exist in December. We save them for other times of the year. But the Victorians knew better. They knew that the darkest time of the year is exactly when you need to acknowledge the darkness, when you need to tell ghost stories and send weird cards and remind yourself that yes, life is short and death is real and terrible things happen, but also, we are here now, we are alive now, we have this fire and this food and these people we love. And that is worth celebrating, not in spite of the darkness, but because of it. So the next time you're sitting around on Christmas Eve, maybe after the presents are opened and the meal is eaten and things have gotten quiet, try telling a ghost story. Not a gory slasher film kind of story, but a real Victorian ghost story. Something sad and beautiful and a little bit frightening. Something that makes you feel the weight of winter and darkness, and all the people who came before you, all the Christmas Eves that have passed, all the ghosts we carry with us. Your family might look at you like you're crazy at first, but I bet they will lean in. I bet they will listen. Because there is something in us that still responds to those old stories. Something that knows, deep down, that Christmas and ghosts belong together. Now, speaking of Victorian traditions that make no sense to us today, we have only scratched the surface, because while they were telling ghost stories and sending bizarre cards, they were also decorating their homes in ways that would make a modern fire marshal have an absolute panic attack. In the next part, we're going to talk about Victorian Christmas trees, and I need to warn you, these were not the safe LED-lit trees we have today. These were death traps, beautiful, glittering, incredibly dangerous death traps with real candles and ornaments you would not believe. Stay with me for this one. It gets wild. Picture yourself walking into a Victorian parlor on Christmas Eve. The room is dark except for one glowing magical sight in the corner, the Christmas tree, and it is absolutely breathtakingly beautiful. Dozens of tiny flames flickering on the branches, ornaments catching and reflecting the candlelight, gilded walnuts gleaming like treasure, strings of popcorn draped like pearl necklaces, glass baubles in ruby red and sapphire blue, paper angels hovering among the evergreen needles. It looks like something out of a fairy tale. And then you notice something else. Buckets of water lined up against the wall, buckets of sand, a wet blanket folded and ready nearby, and someone, probably the father of the house, standing close to the tree with his eyes never leaving those burning candles, watching, waiting, ready to spring into action at the first sign of trouble. Because Victorian Christmas trees were not just beautiful, they were dangerous. Genuinely, seriously, life-threateningly dangerous. Let me give you some numbers that will make your modern, safety-conscious heart stop. In 1885, a Christmas tree fire burned down an entire hospital in Chicago. A hospital. full of sick people who could not escape quickly. In 1908, insurance companies tried to pass a law making it illegal to use candles on Christmas trees because the fires were so common, so devastating, that they were losing too much money paying out claims. The law did not pass, by the way. People kept using candles anyway. Victorian families would only keep their trees lit for about 30 minutes at a time. 30 minutes! That is how dangerous it was. You could not just turn on your tree in the morning and leave it glowing all day like we do now. No, you lit the candles, you stood there watching every single second, and after half an hour you blew them all out again. Because if you did not, if you got distracted or forgot or fell asleep, your entire house could go up in flames. And it happened. All the time. It happened so often that newspapers barely even reported individual Christmas tree fires anymore unless someone died. It was just part of life. Oh, the Smiths down the street lost their parlor in a Christmas tree fire. How unfortunate. Pass the plum pudding. But here is what I find so fascinating. The Victorians knew this. They absolutely knew how dangerous it was, and they did it anyway. Why? Because it was beautiful. Because the sight of a candlelit Christmas tree in a dark room was so magical, so enchanting, so perfect, that it was worth the risk. Think about that for a moment. We live in a world where we recall toys if the paint might have too much lead, where we put warning labels on coffee cups saying the coffee is hot, where we bubble wrap our children and our lives to avoid any possible danger. And the Victorians, they were putting open flames on dried evergreen branches inside their wooden houses and calling it a holiday tradition. Now, in 1878, a man named Frederick Arts invented something that was supposed to make Christmas trees safer. It was a little metal clip that could hold a candle firmly onto a branch. The idea was that if the candle was properly secured, it would not fall and start a fire. Clever, right? Wrong. Because now people could put even more candles on their trees, and those candles still burned, and the branches still dried out, and the houses still burned down. The clip-on candle holder did not solve the problem. It just made people feel safer while doing the exact same dangerous thing. It was not until 1882 that someone finally invented a real solution. Edward Johnson, who worked for Thomas Edison's electric light company, created the first electrically illuminated Christmas tree. He wired 80 little light bulbs, red and white and blue, onto his tree and displayed it in his home in New York City. People came from all over to see this miracle. A Christmas tree that glowed without fire. A tree you could leave lit all evening without fear. But do you know how long it took for electric lights to catch on? Decades. Electric lights were expensive. Most homes did not even have electricity yet. And besides, people liked their candles. They liked the flicker, the warmth, the romance of real flame. So they kept using them, kept risking their lives, for years and years after a safer option existed. But the candles were not even the most bizarre part of Victorian Christmas trees. Let us talk about the ornaments. Because when I said earlier that Victorians decorated their trees with doll heads and taxidermied animals, I was not exaggerating. I was not using a metaphor. I meant it literally. Victorian Christmas tree ornaments included actual doll heads. Just the heads, no bodies. Creepy porcelain faces with glass eyes staring out from between the evergreen branches. Sometimes these heads were attached to little fabric bodies dressed like angels. Sometimes they were just heads, hanging there, watching you. Why? Well, porcelain doll heads were relatively cheap to produce, and they caught the candlelight beautifully. The Victorians thought they were charming. We think they are the stuff of nightmares, but hey, different times. And then there were the taxidermied animals. Small ones usually. Birds, mice, squirrels. Victorians loved taxidermy. They had stuffed birds under glass domes in their parlours. They wore dead hummingbirds in their hats. So naturally, why not hang a stuffed robin or a preserved mouse on your Christmas tree? It made perfect sense to them. Although, to be fair, most families could not afford real taxidermy for their trees, so they made do with cotton batting shaped like animals, or cardboard cutouts, or little plaster figures. But the wealthy families, they went all out. They had actual taxidermied creatures nestled among the branches like some kind of Victorian natural history museum mixed with a fairy tale. The Victorians also hung food on their trees, lots and lots of food, apples and oranges and nuts, cookies cut into festive shapes, candy wrapped in coloured paper, gingerbread men, strings of popcorn, little paper cones called cornucopias filled with sweets. This sounds lovely, right? Edible ornaments. Except think about what happens when you hang food on a tree and leave it there for days or weeks, in a heated room, with candles burning nearby. The fruit starts to rot, the cookies go stale, the candy melts, and if you had mice or rats in your house, which most Victorians did because this was before modern pest control, well, you basically just created a buffet table for rodents. In your parlor, Merry Christmas. But that was actually part of the point. The Christmas tree was meant to be temporary, ephemeral. You put it up on Christmas Eve, you enjoyed it for 12 days until Epiphany, and then you took it down. The children were allowed to eat the edible decorations on Christmas Day. That was their treat. That was part of the magic. You got to pluck cookies and candy and gilded walnuts off the tree and consume the decorations themselves. Can you imagine doing that now? Eating food that has been hanging on a tree for 12 days? We would be horrified. But for Victorian children, it was the highlight of Christmas. They would stand on tiptoes, eyes gleaming, picking through the branches looking for the best treats, while the candles guttered and the room filled with the smell of evergreen and melting wax. And speaking of wax, here is another thing that will make you shudder. The Victorians did not just use plain candles, they used coloured wax candles in pink and green and yellow. And these candles would drip, hot wax dripping down onto the branches, onto the ornaments, onto the presents piled underneath. Pools of coloured wax hardening on the carpet. It was messy and dangerous, and absolutely normal. Some Victorian families tried to be clever about the fire risk. They would coat the lower branches of their tree in alum, a chemical compound that was supposed to make the wood less flammable. Did it work? Sort of. A little bit. Not enough to actually prevent fires, but enough to make people feel like they were being responsible. Others would wrap the base of their tree in fireproof material, or keep it in a special stand filled with water, trying to keep the tree as fresh and moist as possible. But evergreen trees dry out quickly indoors, especially when you have a fire roaring in the fireplace and candles burning on the tree itself. Within a few days, those needles were basically kindling. One spark and the whole thing could go up, and yet they persisted. Year after year, Christmas after Christmas, lighting their beautiful deadly trees. There is actually a scientific explanation for how fast a Christmas tree can burn. Modern fire safety experts have done experiments. They take a dried-out Fraser fir, light it on fire, and measure what happens. Do you know how long it takes for a completely dry Christmas tree to be consumed by flames? 60 seconds. 1 minute. From ignition to total destruction. And in those 60 seconds, the temperature in the room can reach over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The smoke becomes so thick you cannot see. The fire spreads to the curtains, the furniture, the walls. By the time you realize what is happening, it is already too late to stop it. The Victorians did not have this scientific data, but they knew from experience. They had seen houses burn. They had heard the stories. Everyone knew someone who had lost their home to a Christmas tree fire, but still they lit those candles. Because the alternative, having a dark tree, felt wrong. It felt like missing the whole point of Christmas, and I think there is something almost admirable about that, in a terrifying sort of way. The Victorians were willing to risk literal fire for beauty, for magic, for the experience of seeing their children's faces light up in the glow of those candles, for 30 perfect, perilous minutes of wonder. We have lost that, I think. Not the danger, thank goodness. We should absolutely keep using safe LED lights. But we've lost the willingness to accept that beauty sometimes comes with cost, that creating magic requires effort and risk and sacrifice. The Victorians understood that nothing worth having is entirely safe. Their Christmas trees were temporary works of art. Every family created their own unique vision year after year. Some trees were elegant and refined, decorated only in white and gold. Others were explosions of colour, crammed with every ornament the family owned. Some featured elaborate homemade decorations that took weeks to create. Others were simple, with just apples and paper chains and candles. But every single one was dangerous. Every single one required constant vigilance, and every single one was absolutely heartbreakingly beautiful. Now, if you're thinking that Victorian Christmas could not possibly get any stranger than ghost stories, bizarre greeting cards, and flaming trees covered in doll heads, I have news for you. We have barely scratched the surface, because the Victorians had another Christmas tradition that is even more baffling than everything we have discussed so far. They had Christmas games, parlor games played on Christmas Eve and Christmas night. And some of these games were so weird, so dangerous, so absolutely insane, that you will not believe they were real. In the next part, I am going to tell you about a game called Snapdragon. And trust me, you are going to want to hear this. It involves fire, alcohol, and children sticking their hands into flames for fun. Victorian Christmas keeps getting darker and stranger, and we're only halfway through. Stay with me. Here is what I need you to understand about Snapdragon. This was not some obscure, rarely played party trick that a few eccentric Victorians tried once and immediately abandoned. This was a beloved Christmas tradition. It was mentioned by Shakespeare. It appeared in Charles Dickens' novels. Samuel Johnson included it in his famous Dictionary of the English Language in 1755. For hundreds of years, from the 16th century all the way into the early 1900s, families gathered around bowls of flaming brandy on Christmas Eve and stuck their hands into fire, on purpose, for fun. Let me walk you through exactly how this game worked, because I promise you, knowing the details makes it even more insane. First, you need a wide, shallow bowl or platter. The wider and shallower the better, because you want maximum surface area for the flames. Then you pour in about 24 raisins. Sometimes people used almonds or grapes or plums, but raisins were the classic choice. The Victorians called these raisins snapdragons, which is where the game got its name. Next, you pour brandy over the fruit. A lot of brandy. You want those raisins swimming in it, bobbing up and down, as one description charmingly put it, like drowning flies. Then you heat up a bit more brandy in a separate pan until it is good and warm, and you pour that heated brandy over the whole mixture. Now comes the dramatic part. You dim all the lights in the room. Remember, the Victorians did not have electric lights, so when they dimmed the candles, the room became very, very dark. And in that darkness, with everyone gathered around the table, someone lights the brandy on fire, and it burns blue. This eerie, ghostly, supernatural blue flame that makes everyone around the bowl look demonic. Their faces lit from below by flickering blue fire, eyes gleaming, shadows dancing on the walls. It must have been absolutely beautiful and absolutely terrifying at the same time. Then, one by one, people take turns plunging their hands through the flames to grab a raisin. If you succeed, You pull out the burning raisin and immediately pop it into your mouth to extinguish the flame, and then you eat it. You eat the flaming, brandy-soaked raisin. There was even a poem that people would recite while playing. It went like this. With his blue and lapping tongue, many of you will be stung. Snip, snap, dragon, for he snaps at all that comes, snatching at his feast of plums. Snip, snap, dragon. Can you even imagine? Can you imagine gathering your children around a bowl of burning alcohol and encouraging them to stick their hands in the fire while chanting poetry about being stung by a dragon? Now you might be thinking, okay, but surely this was dangerous, right? Surely people got hurt. Yes, they absolutely did. People burned their fingers, they burned their mouths, they splashed flaming brandy on themselves, on the table, on the floor. One writer from 1900 named William L. Alden described the game as providing a considerable amount of laughter and merriment at the expense of the unsuccessful competitors. The unsuccessful competitors being presumably the ones who were on fire, and yet, here is the fascinating thing. From a purely scientific perspective, Snapdragon is actually not as dangerous as it sounds. And I know this because modern fire scientists have studied it. They have tried it. They have explained the chemistry. The blue flame you see when brandy burns is caused by something called chemiluminescence, not thermal radiation. What that means is the flame produces light but not much heat. It is nothing like a yellow candle flame, which burns at twice the temperature. Brandy is only about 50% alcohol, so it does not burn as hot as higher proof spirits. And the raisins themselves? They act like tiny wicks. The brandy coating the outside burns, but the raisin inside stays relatively cool. Plus, raisins do not conduct heat very well. So if you're quick, if you grab a raisin and immediately put it in your mouth, and close your mouth to cut off the oxygen, the flame goes out and you are fine. So the Victorians were not actually insane. They were playing with fire, yes, but they had figured out through trial and error exactly what kind of fire they could play with relatively safely. They knew to use brandy, not stronger alcohol. They knew to use shallow bowls, not deep ones. They knew to move quickly and not hesitate. But does that make it safe? Absolutely not. Because here is what happens when you add the human element. People get competitive. They get drunk. They get overconfident. Someone pours too much brandy and the flames get too high. Someone splashes flaming liquid across the table. A child gets scared and knocks over the bowl. And suddenly your lovely parlor game has turned into an actual emergency. The Victorians knew this could happen. They played anyway. Because the thrill was part of the point. The danger was part of the fun. You were supposed to be a little bit scared. That is what made snatching the raisin from the dragon's mouth feel like an accomplishment. There was even a superstition attached to the game. It was believed that whoever snatched the most raisins from the burning brandy would meet their true love within a year. So young people especially would compete fiercely. They would take risks. They would reach into the flames again and again, trying to prove their bravery and win the promise of romance. Sometimes one of the raisins would have a gold button hidden inside it, and that became the lucky raisin. Whoever got that raisin could claim a boon, a favour of their choosing, from the person hosting the party. In one story, a young Prince Charles, who would later become King Charles I of England, played Snapdragon in the royal household and caught the lucky raisin. As his favour, he requested the freedom of Walter Raleigh, who was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Now, did that actually happen? Probably not. But the fact that people told stories like this shows how important and meaningful the game was to them. Snapdragon even had a variant called Flapdragon, which was somehow even more ridiculous. In Flapdragon, you would place a lit candle in a mug of ale. Then people would try to drink from the mug without setting their hair or beard on fire. I am not making this up. Victorians would drink from mugs with burning candles in them. for entertainment. And Snapdragon was not the only dangerous Christmas game the Victorians played. Oh no, they had a whole arsenal of activities designed to injure, humiliate and intoxicate their guests. There was Blind Man's Buff, which we still play today in a much gentler form. But the Victorian version? It was brutal. One person would be blindfolded and spun around until they were dizzy and disoriented. Then they would have to try to catch the other players who would dodge and weave out of the way. But here is the Victorian twist. It was considered perfectly acceptable, even encouraged, to deliberately move furniture into the path of the blindfolded person, to set up obstacles specifically to trip them. The goal was to make them fall as hard and as painfully as possible. One contemporary account stated that it is lawful to set anything in the way for folks to tumble over, whether it be to break arms, legs or heads. It is no matter. No matter! Breaking someone's arm or leg or head was no matter. It was just part of the fun. William L. Alden, that same gentleman who wrote about Snapdragon, also wrote about his experience with Blind Man's Buff. He said, "I have suffered much from Christmas games. I have played Blind Man's Buff and caught the corner of a particularly hard pianoforte with my forehead. A pianoforte with his forehead at a Christmas party. The injuries from Blind Man's Buff were so common and so severe that people whispered the game had been invented by country bone setters as a way to drum up business." Think about that. The game was so dangerous that people genuinely believed doctors had created it to ensure a steady stream of patients with broken bones. There was even a variation where everyone except one person was blindfolded. That person would ring a bell and move around the room, and all the blindfolded guests would charge toward the sound of the bell, crashing into furniture and each other in a desperate attempt to catch the bellman. Because apparently having one blindfolded person stumbling around was not chaotic enough. They needed mass blindfolded mayhem. Then there was a game called Hot Cockles. One person would sit on the floor with their head in someone else's lap, unable to see. The other party guests would come up one at a time and kick the player from behind. The player would have to guess who kicked them. If they guessed correctly, they would trade places with the kicker. If not, they would get kicked again and again, until they finally figured it out or until everyone got bored of kicking them. Merry Christmas! Here is a game where we kick you repeatedly while you cannot see. Or there was questions and commands, which was basically Victorian truth or dare. But instead of just asking embarrassing questions or giving silly dares, if you refused to answer or refused to complete your command, your face would be completely blackened with soot from the fireplace. Not just a little smudge, your entire face. So you would have to walk around the rest of the party looking like a chimney sweep. Humiliation as entertainment. And we cannot forget about the drinking challenges. Victorian Christmas parties featured strong ale flavoured with nutmeg and sugar, and people would often combine drinking with the traditional challenge of trying to spin around 50 times in 1 minute, which, as you can imagine, resulted in most participants being violently ill, or, as one source delightfully phrased it, having to reel home or lie down in the barn. Nothing says Merry Christmas quite like vomiting in a barn after spinning yourself into a stupor, am I right? But here is what I find so interesting about all of this. We look at these Victorian Christmas games and we think they are insane. We think, how could anyone possibly think this was fun? How could parents let their children play games involving fire and violence and public humiliation? But the Victorians would look at our modern Christmas and think we are boring. They would think we are soft. We sit around watching television. We play video games. We open presents and eat too much food and then fall asleep on the couch. Where is the excitement? Where is the risk? Where is the adventure? The Victorians believed that Christmas should be memorable, that it should involve real physical experiences that brought people together through shared danger and shared laughter. Yes, someone might get hurt, Yes, someone might get their face covered in soot or their fingers burned or their head cracked on a pianoforte, but they would remember it. It would become a story. It would become part of the family mythology. And in a way, that is what all of these dangerous traditions were about. Creating stories, creating memories, creating experiences that could not be replicated by simply sitting still and being safe. We've gained a lot by making Christmas safer. Fewer house fires, fewer broken bones, fewer children with burned fingers. But we've also lost something. We have lost the understanding that joy sometimes requires risk, that magic sometimes requires danger, that the most memorable experiences are often the ones where something could go wrong but doesn't. The Victorians understood this. They embraced it. They built an entire holiday around it. But we're not done exploring the strange and wonderful world of Victorian Christmas. Because while they were busy setting themselves on fire and breaking each other's bones, they were also eating food that would make your modern, health-conscious stomach turn. In the next part, we're going to talk about the Victorian Christmas feast, and I promise you, it was like nothing you have ever imagined. Coffin-shaped meat pies, boars' heads with blood dripping from the mouth, gelatinized turkey moulded into shapes. The Victorian Christmas table was a place of wonder and horror in equal measure. Stay with me for this culinary journey into the past. You will never look at Christmas dinner the same way again. Picture this. You sit down to a beautiful Victorian Christmas dinner. The table gleams with white linens and silver. A roasted turkey sits as the centerpiece. But wait. Something is wrong. The turkey is not steaming. It is cold. And when you cut into it, the meat does not separate into tender slices. Instead, it wobbles. The entire bird has been transformed into meat-flavored jelly, suspended in a thick gelatin that jiggles when you touch it. Welcome to the reality of Victorian Christmas dinner, where nothing was quite what it seemed, and everything was a lot more disturbing than the greeting card suggested. We have spent time together exploring the horrors of Victorian Christmas, from the workhouse meals to the flaming trees, but now we need to talk about the food itself. Because while Dickens was writing about the Cratchit family gathering around their modest goose, wealthy Victorians were creating culinary nightmares that would make modern food safety inspectors weep. Let us start with something that sounds innocent. Mince pies. You have probably eaten one. They are small, sweet pastries filled with dried fruit and spices, right? Wrong. Not in Victorian England, not until late in the era. For most of the 1800s, mince pies contained actual meat, not a trace amount, not a symbolic inclusion. 1/3 of the filling was minced beef or mutton. The recipe from Eliza Acton's Modern Cookery for Private Families, published in 1845, calls for 1.5 pounds of lean underdone roast beef combined with 2 pounds of beef sweet. That is almost 4 pounds of animal products before you even add the fruit. Then came the 1 pound of stoned raisins, 1 pound of sultanas, 1.5 pounds of apples, 1.5 pounds of pears, mixed peel, almonds, and the peel of 2 oranges and 2 lemons. The mixture was then drenched with 1/2 pint of brandy, 1/2 pint of sherry, 1/2 pint of port wine, and 1/4 pint of white rum. Can you imagine cutting into what looks like a dessert and tasting beef? The Victorians believed this was delicious. They consumed 1 mince pie on each of the 12 days of Christmas for good luck throughout the year. 12 meat-filled pastries. This was not some peasant food either. This was what the wealthy ate. The poor could not afford the brandy, the port, the exotic spices. Victorian Christmas cookbook writer Mrs. Beeton gave 2 recipes for mincemeat in her famous household management book from 1861. One with meat, one without. The one with meat was listed first, indicating it was the preferred version. Why meat in a Christmas pie? The tradition dated back to the Crusades. Returning knights brought Middle Eastern cooking methods that combined meats, fruits, and spices. The addition of cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg was meant to symbolize the gifts of the three wise men. The oblong shape of the pies was meant to resemble Jesus' manger. Some pies even had a pastry baby Jesus placed on top. This is where things got controversial. During the English Civil War in the 1600s, Puritans tried to ban Christmas pies as Catholic idolatry. They failed, but the baby Jesus decoration quietly disappeared. By the Victorian era, the pies were round. The religious symbolism was muted, but the meat remained. Here is what a Victorian food historian discovered when recreating the recipe. The meat is not obvious, but your mince pies will be rich, luxurious, and disturbingly savoury for something you expected to be sweet. The beef adds what modern cooks call umami, a depth of flavour that fruit alone cannot provide. But it also means you're essentially eating a boozy meat pie for dessert on 12 consecutive days. Think about that the next time you see a cute Victorian Christmas card showing a family gathered around a festive table. They were eating meat pies for luck, 12 of them. No wonder Victorian medicine was so concerned with digestion problems, but mince pies were just the beginning. The true centerpiece of a wealthy Victorian Christmas dinner was something far more disturbing: the boar's head. You have heard the carol. The boar's head in hand bring I, bedecked with bays and rosemary. It sounds poetic, festive, medieval. What the carol does not mention is the week of preparation required to turn a pig's head into a dish suitable for a Christmas table, or the fact that by the Victorian era, wild boars had been extinct in Britain for centuries, so the super wealthy had to import boar heads from Germany, while everyone else used a regular pig's head and pretended. Let me walk you through the Victorian process for preparing a boar's head, as described in cooking manuals from the era. First, you needed to bone the head, leaving only the jawbones for shape and the tusks for authenticity. Then you cut it at the second vertebrae to get the right size. Next came the brining process. The head was submerged in red wine brine for 2 weeks. Not 2 days, 2 weeks, and you had to turn the skin every single day to ensure even pickling. After 2 weeks of daily flipping a severed head in wine, you moved to stuffing. The inside was filled with a mixture of pig's liver, chopped apples, onion, sage, and rosemary about 1/2 inch thick. Then came a second layer of stuffing made from sausage meat, squares of ox tongue, chopped truffles, chopped mushrooms, chopped pistachio nuts, minced rosemary, a wine glass of Calvados or sherry and cream. The head was then sewn up, wrapped in a strong cloth, and boiled for 7 hours. Some recipes called for 8 to 9 hours. 7 hours of boiling a cloth-wrapped severed head. During the boiling, you had to keep adding water as it evaporated. The Victorian cookbook instructed cooks to add more red wine halfway through for flavour. After 7 hours, the head was removed, pressed into a mould while still hot, and left to cool completely. Once cold, the cloth was removed, the threads were cut away, and the head was ready to be presented. But wait, we are not done. For the truly wealthy Victorians who wanted their boar's head to look as natural as life and even more ferocious looking, there was an additional step: creating a plaster of Paris mould. You bought 1/2 bushel of plaster of Paris, which cost about 75 cents at the cement stores. You placed a raw pig's head snout down in a 5-gallon tin can. You mixed the plaster with water to a thin paste and poured it around the head. Once the plaster set, you had a mould. The cooked, pressed meat could then be shaped in this mould to create a perfect, terrifying boar's head that looked ready to charge at the dinner guests. Food historian Annie Gray notes that Victorian cookbooks included specific instructions on how to perk up the ears and how to pipe lard or pastry across the head, sometimes with the family crest. By the Edwardian period, caterers specialised in boar's head preparation, and there were warnings about unscrupulous suppliers who might use soot to colour a pig's head to make it look like a boar's. Queen Victoria herself served boar's head at Christmas. Her 1894 Christmas dinner menu, written in French as was the royal custom, included a wild boar's head on the side table, alongside a baron of beef, game pie, brawn, woodcock pie, and terrine of foie gras. The boar's head was a gift from Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany, her eldest grandson. It arrived by royal yacht, transported from Windsor Castle to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight on Christmas Eve. The ceremony of bringing in the boar's head was elaborate. It was carried on a gold or silver dish, accompanied by trumpets and songs. The steward led a procession of nobles singing the boar's head carol. Everyone stood. The head, with an apple or orange in its mouth, was placed at the centre of the table. It was meant to symbolise abundance, victory over nature, the triumph of civilization over the wild. What it actually symbolised was wealth, excess, and the ability to spend 2 weeks preparing one dish that would be consumed in minutes. And speaking of excess, we need to discuss what the Victorians did to turkey. Because roasting a bird was apparently too simple, too boring. The wealthy needed to demonstrate their sophistication, their access to the finest ingredients, their command of the latest culinary techniques. So they turned their Christmas turkeys into aspic. Aspic, meat jelly. Gelatin made by boiling down animal bones, skin and cartilage for hours until the collagen dissolved into the liquid. When cooled, this created a thick, wobbly, transparent jelly that could suspend pieces of meat, vegetables and garnishes in a glistening, quivering mass. The process for creating Victorian turkey aspic was labour-intensive. First, you roasted the turkey. Then you carefully carved all the meat from the bones. The bones, skin and cartilage went into a massive pot with water and were boiled for hours. Some recipes called for 4 hours. Some called for 12. The goal was to extract every bit of collagen from the bones. The resulting stock was then strained multiple times through cheesecloth to remove all impurities. You wanted the jelly to be crystal clear. Any cloudiness was considered a failure. Some Victorian cooks added lightly whisked egg whites to the stock and brought it to a boil. The egg whites formed a crust on the surface that trapped all the tiny particles that made the liquid cloudy. This crust was carefully strained off, leaving a perfectly transparent stock. Then came the assembly. You arranged the turkey meat in a mould. Sometimes you added decorative elements, sliced carrots, parsley leaves, sliced hard-boiled eggs, truffle pieces if you were very wealthy. The artistic arrangement was crucial because this dish would be unmoulded and presented whole. The clear stock, still warm but starting to thicken, was poured over the arranged ingredients. The whole thing was refrigerated overnight. In the morning, you had a quivering tower of meat suspended in jelly. Auguste Escoffier, the legendary French chef whose techniques dominated Victorian high cuisine, declared that proper aspic should be at once succulent, limpid, and just sufficiently viscous to allow of it being turned out of a mould without breaking. Limpid, viscous. These were the qualities Victorian diners desired in their Christmas turkey. The tradition dated back to the Middle Ages, when cooks discovered that thickened meat broth cooled into a jelly that kept out air and bacteria, preserving the cooked meat inside. This was practical in an era before refrigeration. By the Victorian era, refrigeration was becoming available to the wealthy, but aspic remained popular as a demonstration of culinary skill. The ability to create a perfectly clear, properly set aspic showed you had trained cooks who understood technique. Marie-Antoine Carême, the chef who cooked for Napoleon's imperial court, perfected the art of aspic making in the early 1800s. His elaborate creations were architectural showpieces, truffles and poultry suspended in jelly, coxcombs and stones in aspic, red calf's tongue and sweetbreads encased in shimmering gelatin. These dishes were first cooked hot, then served cold. That is where the French term chaud-froid comes from, hot-cold. By the Victorian era, aspic had become expected at any proper Christmas feast. Not just turkey, entire game pies were encased in aspic. Salmon was suspended in fish-flavoured jelly. Tongue was sliced and arranged in beef aspic. The Victorian Christmas table was a landscape of quivering, glistening, wobbling meat jellies. And here is the thing that modern people struggle to understand. The Victorians genuinely enjoyed this. Contemporary accounts describe aspic as a delicacy, the way the cold jelly melted in your mouth, releasing the concentrated flavours of the broth. The textural contrast between the firm meat and the soft gelatin. The visual beauty of a perfectly moulded aspic, turned out onto a silver platter, gleaming in the candlelight. But imagine being a child at a Victorian Christmas dinner. You see what looks like a beautiful roasted turkey. You expect hot, savoury meat. Instead, you're served a cold slice of jellied turkey that wobbles on your plate. The texture is slippery. The temperature is wrong. Everything about it contradicts your expectations. This was the Victorian Christmas feast. Mince pies that contained beef. Boar's heads that required 2 weeks of preparation and 7 hours of boiling. Turkeys transformed into meat jelly. And we have not even discussed the turtle soup that was so popular. Turtles were nearly hunted to extinction, leading to the invention of mock turtle soup made from calf's head in thin broth. Or the dozens of other dishes that graced the Victorian Christmas table. The contrast between classes was staggering. While wealthy families were creating elaborate aspics and importing boar's heads from Germany, working-class families were fortunate to have a goose. Many could only afford rabbit. The poorest had nothing. Remember the workhouse Christmas meal we discussed earlier? 6 ounces of beef, 1 pound of potatoes, no aspic, no boar's head, no mince pies with brandy and port. Victorian food writer Eliza Acton actually published a recipe for poor people's Christmas pudding in her 1843 cookbook. It called for boiled and mashed potatoes, boiled and mashed carrots, flour, suet, sugar, dried fruit, spices, 2 eggs, and 1 glass of either brandy, sherry or stout if you could afford it. This was meant to feed 16 people. Compare that to the wealthy Victorian Christmas pudding that required 24 bottles of brandy just for the royal household's 200 puddings. 2 Christmases, 1 country, 1 filled with 7-hour boiled boar's heads and turkey aspic. 1 filled with potato pudding meant to stretch across 16 hungry mouths. And this was during the exact same era when Dickens was writing A Christmas Carol, creating the image of Christmas as a time of warmth, family, and modest but sufficient meals. The Cratchit family's goose was aspirational fiction, not documentary reality. Most working families could not afford even that. The Victorian Christmas feast, like everything else about Victorian Christmas, was a beautiful lie for most people, and a grotesque excess for the few. The elaborate preparations, the exotic ingredients, the hours of labour required to create dishes that would be consumed in minutes, all of it was theatre. Performance. A demonstration of wealth and status disguised as holiday tradition. So the next time you see a Victorian Christmas scene, all rosy cheeks and abundant tables, remember what was actually on those tables. Remember the meat in the mince pies. Remember the week of brining and 7 hours of boiling required for the boar's head. Remember the cold, wobbling turkey aspic. Remember that for every table groaning with excess, there were dozens of families with nothing but workhouse gruel. The Victorian Christmas feast was not about nourishment. It was about display. and like so much of Victorian Christmas, the display was designed to distract from the reality of what was actually happening in that society. But we're not finished with Victorian Christmas food yet, because there is one tradition that deserves its own exploration, a mysterious object that supposedly came from Germany, but might be an American invention, a peculiar practice that involves hiding something in a Christmas tree, and a set of customs around Christmas Day meals that reveal just how different the Victorian celebration was from our modern assumptions. Those revelations are waiting just ahead. There is a German Christmas tradition that Americans love to talk about. You may have heard of it. On Christmas Eve, parents hide a pickle-shaped ornament somewhere deep in the branches of the Christmas tree. On Christmas morning, the first child to find the pickle receives an extra present from Santa Claus, or perhaps a year of good fortune. The tradition is called the Weihnachtsgurke, the Christmas pickle, and it is a beloved custom that has been passed down through German families for centuries, except none of that is true, not even a little bit. The Germans have no idea what you're talking about. In 2016, a survey asked 2,057 Germans if they had ever heard of the Christmas pickle tradition. 91% had never heard of it. Of the remaining 9% who had heard of it, only 2% said their families actually practiced it. And do you know where those 2% learned about it? From Americans. The Christmas pickle is not a German tradition. It is an American marketing campaign from the 1890s that was so successful, so thoroughly convincing, that it created a tradition out of thin air. And the story of how this happened reveals something crucial about Victorian Christmas. Almost everything we think of as traditional was actually invented, manufactured, and sold to us. Victorian Christmas was not discovered. It was designed for profit. Let us start with the pickle itself, because the origin stories are delightfully absurd. According to one popular version, a Bavarian-born soldier named John C. Lower enlisted in the 103rd Pennsylvania Infantry during the American Civil War. He was captured in April of 1864 and taken to Camp Sumter, the notorious Confederate prison camp. On Christmas Eve, while starving to death, he begged a guard for one last pickle before he died. The guard, moved by compassion, or perhaps just bored, provided a pickle. This pickle, supposedly blessed by God, gave Lower the strength to survive. After the war, he returned to his family and began the tradition of hiding a pickle on their Christmas tree each year to commemorate his miraculous survival. Sweet story, completely unverifiable. There is no documentation of John C. Lower receiving a pickle at Camp Sumter. There is no evidence he started any such tradition. The story appears to have been invented whole cloth sometime in the late 1800s. But wait, there is another origin story. This one comes from Berrien Springs, Michigan, which declared itself the Christmas pickle capital of the world and held an annual pickle festival from 1992 until 2005, complete with a pickle parade. According to the Berrien Springs version, 2 Spanish children were staying at an inn when the evil innkeeper murdered them and stuffed their bodies into a pickle barrel. Along came St. Nicholas, who discovered the crime, tapped on the pickle barrel 3 times, and miraculously brought the boys back to life. Can you imagine being a Spanish child who narrowly escaped death by pickle barrel? And every Christmas your family reminds you of your near-death experience by hanging a pickle on the tree? Merry Christmas. Remember when you almost died in a vat of brine? This story, for the record, is actually based on a much older medieval legend that has nothing to do with Christmas. The original version involves St. Nicholas resurrecting 3 boys who'd been murdered by a butcher and stored in a barrel of salt brine, not pickles. The pickle barrel detail was added later, probably by someone trying to sell pickle ornaments. Which brings us to the actual origin of the Christmas pickle. In 1880, a German salesman walked into Frank Woolworth's store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with a case of glass ornaments from Germany. Woolworth had opened his first successful five-and-dime store the previous year, and he was skeptical. He told the salesman that Americans would not waste their money on ornaments that did not do anything. They were just decorative, useless. But the salesman was persistent. They struck a deal. Woolworth purchased one case of 144 ornaments on the condition that he could return them if they did not sell. The decorations sold out in less than a day, generating a profit of $4.32. 3 cents per ornament. Woolworth had found a winner. The next year he doubled his order and sold out again. By 1890 he was travelling to Germany himself, specifically to the town of Lauscher, where he placed an order for 100,000 sets of ornaments. Lauscher had been known for 200 years for its glass blowing. The town had been producing glass ornaments in the shapes of fruits and nuts since 1847. These ornaments were individually blown by craftsmen, made of mercury glass that had a beautiful silvery sheen. The supplier Woolworth worked with, a gentleman named Mr. Wilmsham, later gave an interview where he explained the scale of their operation. He said, and this is a direct quote, "Mr. Woolworth had at that time only a few stores, but I grew with Woolworth. I have sold them at least $25 million worth of Christmas tree ornaments. In 1 year, $800,000 worth. $25 million worth of Christmas ornaments in the late 1800s. This was not a cottage industry. This was mass production meeting mass consumption. Christmas had become big business. Among those ornaments from Lauscher were glass vegetables, fruits, nuts, and yes, pickles. According to the Berrien County Historical Association, the pickle ornaments were not popular sellers. They sat on shelves while the bells, angels, and stars flew off the hooks. Woolworth, or possibly one of his suppliers, needed a story to move the surplus pickle inventory. Someone, somewhere, came up with the legend. The time-honoured German tradition of the Christmas pickle. The packaging even explained it. A centuries-old German custom where the pickle is the last ornament hung on the tree, and the first child to find it receives an extra gift. The boxes labelled the ornaments as Weihnachtsgurke, which is indeed German for Christmas pickle, lending an air of authenticity, and Americans bought it. Literally. They loved the idea of following an ancient European tradition. It connected them to their German heritage, or to a romanticized version of German culture. The pickle ornaments sold out. The tradition spread. By the early 1900s, American families were hiding pickles on their Christmas trees every year, certain they were participating in a practice that German families had been doing for generations. The Germans, meanwhile, had no idea this was happening. When American tourists started asking about the Christmas pickle in German shops, the shopkeepers were baffled. What pickle? What tradition? One German Christmas market vendor described Americans coming in and requesting Weihnachtsgurke ornaments, and the German vendors having to explain that no such tradition existed in Germany. But here is where it gets even more interesting. Once Germans learned that Americans wanted Christmas pickles because they thought it was a German tradition, German manufacturers started making Christmas pickles to sell to American tourists. In Lauscher, the town where the ornaments originally came from, you can now buy Christmas pickles in every shop. The packaging explains that Americans have this wonderful tradition, and you can bring it back to Germany. The myth has come full circle. Germany's now exporting Christmas pickles back to America, labelled as an American tradition that Americans think is German. The confusion is complete, but the Christmas pickle is just one small example of a much larger transformation that happened during the Victorian era. The commercialization of Christmas. The German imports did not stop at ornaments. Woolworth discovered that Europe was the source for almost everything Americans wanted to buy. In 1890, he and his business partner B.F. Hunt Jr. took their first buying trip to Europe. They visited 25 pottery factories in Staffordshire, England, selecting willow pattern china. They bought postcards and books in London. They purchased toys and decorations in Hanover and Dresden, Germany, clocks from Geneva, Switzerland, fancy goods in Paris, France. Woolworth's business model was revolutionary. He cut out the middlemen, the wholesalers who acted as agents for overseas goods. He went directly to the source, buying in massive quantities at lower prices. This allowed him to sell items for 5 cents or 10 cents that previously cost much more. He democratized Christmas. Suddenly the middle class could afford the decorations, the ornaments, the gifts that had previously been luxuries for the wealthy. And this is the crucial point. Victorian Christmas was not just invented, it was sold. The Christmas tree itself, while German in origin, only became popular in England after Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were illustrated in the Illustrated London News in 1848, gathered around a lavishly decorated tree at Windsor Castle. That image captivated the British public. Within a year, middle-class families were rushing to buy their own trees. Prince Albert had brought the tradition from Germany when he married Victoria. The royal couple decorated their trees themselves on Christmas Eve with candles, gingerbread, and small gifts. They had multiple trees at Windsor Castle. One for Victoria, one for Albert, one for Victoria's mother, one for the children to share, one for the royal household, and one for the servants. Each tree sat on a table with presents arranged underneath, a German tradition called Heiligabend-Bescherung, exchanging gifts on Christmas Eve rather than Christmas morning. The 1848 illustration was reprinted in America in 1850 in Godey's Lady's Book, a popular women's magazine. The engraver made one clever change. He removed Queen Victoria's crown and Prince Albert's moustache, making the royal family look like an ordinary American family. Suddenly, Christmas trees were not just for royalty, they were for everyone. By the end of the 1850s, Christmas trees were well established in both England and America. Do you see the pattern? A tradition is imported from Germany. It is adopted by British royalty. It is illustrated in the popular press. The middle class rushes to emulate the royals. Manufacturers see the demand and start producing ornaments, decorations, cards, gifts. Retailers like Woolworth import these products and sell them at affordable prices. The tradition becomes universal within a generation. This is Victorian Christmas, not ancient customs passed down through generations, but a perfectly orchestrated commercial phenomenon. And the Victorians were brilliant at it. They understood something fundamental about human nature. People want to belong. They want to participate in traditions. They want their homes to look like the idealized images they see in magazines and shop windows, and they are willing to pay for it. The Victorian era saw the development of almost every Christmas tradition we still cherish today. Christmas cards were invented in England in 1843 by Henry Cole, who commissioned an artist to create a card he could send to friends instead of writing individual letters. The first card showed a family drinking wine together, with side panels depicting acts of charity. It was controversial because one of the figures was a child drinking wine, but it sold. Within a few years, Christmas cards were being mass-produced and sent by the millions. Christmas crackers, those paper tubes that pop when you pull them, were invented in London in 1847 by Tom Smith, a confectioner who was inspired by French bonbons wrapped in paper. He added the snap mechanism and a small gift inside. By the 1850s, crackers were standard at Christmas dinners. Even Father Christmas himself was redesigned during the Victorian era. The traditional British Father Christmas was a rather stern figure in green robes associated with adult feasting and drinking. The jolly, red-suited, gift-giving Santa Claus was an American creation from the mid-1800s, based partly on the Dutch Sinterklaas and partly on the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, published in 1823. This image was exported back to England, where it merged with Father Christmas, creating the modern Santa we know today. Every single one of these traditions was created, refined, and sold during the Victorian era, and the engine behind it all was commerce. Department stores created elaborate Christmas window displays. Catalogues featured pages of toys and gifts. Magazines published articles on how to decorate your home for Christmas. Newspapers ran advertisements for Christmas sales. The message was clear. To have a proper Christmas, you needed to buy things. And here is the uncomfortable truth. It worked. Victorian Christmas created the template we still follow. We decorate trees with ornaments, we send cards, we exchange gifts, we gather for elaborate meals, we tell children about Santa Claus. We believe we are following ancient traditions, when in fact we are following a script written by Victorian marketers and manufacturers. The working class, the people in the workhouses eating 6 ounces of beef, they were not participating in this commercial Christmas. They could not afford it. The elaborate Christmas feast, the decorated tree, the gifts, the cards, these were markers of middle-class status. The Victorians invented Christmas as a consumer experience, and in doing so they created a new kind of social division. Not just between rich and poor, but between those who could afford to perform Christmas correctly and those who could not. Charles Dickens understood this. A Christmas Carol, published in 1843, is often credited with inventing the modern Christmas. But Dickens was not describing reality. He was creating aspiration. The Cratchit family's modest but loving Christmas was meant to show what Christmas could be if society cared for its poor. But the book itself became a commercial product. It sold 6,000 copies in the first week. It was adapted for stage performances. It became another piece of Christmas merchandise. The irony is profound. Dickens wrote a story criticizing Victorian society's treatment of the poor, and Victorian society turned it into a bestseller and used it to justify their Christmas celebrations. Look, we are like the reformed Scrooge. We give to charity at Christmas. We gather our families. We celebrate the season. Never mind that the workhouses were still full. Never mind that children were still dying in factories. Never mind that the elaborate Christmas feast required servants to work through the holiday while wealthy families celebrated. Victorian Christmas was a beautiful performance built on a foundation of commerce and inequality. The traditions we inherited are not ancient wisdom passed down through generations. They are products, carefully designed, expertly marketed and sold to people who wanted to believe they were participating in something timeless. The Christmas pickle is the perfect symbol for all of this. A fake German tradition created to sell surplus inventory, believed so thoroughly that it became real. Not real in the sense that it has ancient origins, but real in the sense that families now actually practice it. They hide pickles on their trees, they tell their children the story, they create memories around it. The tradition may have been invented for profit, but it has become genuine through practice. And that is Victorian Christmas in a nutshell. Invented traditions that became real through repetition and belief. Commercial products that became cultural touchstones. A holiday that was designed to sell ornaments and cards and gifts, but which also created genuine moments of connection and joy for the people who participated in it. So the next time you hang a pickle ornament on your tree, or send a Christmas card, or gather around a decorated evergreen, remember, you're not participating in ancient traditions, you're participating in Victorian capitalism. And somehow, despite knowing this, Despite understanding that it was all manufactured, it still feels meaningful, which might be the most Victorian thing of all. But speaking of Victorian social divisions, we need to examine the two completely different Christmases that existed in the same country, in the same cities, sometimes on the same streets. Because while some Victorians were hiding pickles in imported German ornaments, others were deciding whether to enter the workhouse or starve. And the contrast between these two Christmases reveals the true nature of Victorian society in ways that all the decorations and carols tried desperately to hide. On Christmas Day, 1895, two dinners were being prepared in London within walking distance of each other. In one home, a family of 8 gathered around a table laden with roast turkey, plum pudding, mince pies, chestnuts, wine, and imported oranges. The children had received new dolls, wooden trains, and books. A decorated tree stood in the corner, covered with glass ornaments from Germany, candles flickering in the winter light. Carols were sung, gifts were exchanged, laughter filled the rooms. In the other home, a woman worked alone in the kitchen. She had been there since 5 in the morning, preparing the feast for the family upstairs, roasting the turkey, making the pudding, polishing the silver, setting the table. She would not sit down to eat with them. She would not open presents with her own children, because her children were not there. They were at home, miles away, waiting for their mother to finish working. She would see them on December 26th if she was lucky. On Christmas Day she served. This is the reality of Victorian Christmas that the greeting cards never showed. While the middle and upper classes were creating the elaborate traditions we still follow today, the people who made those traditions possible were working, cooking, cleaning, serving, missing their own families so that wealthy families could gather together. Before the Victorian era, December 25th was just another working day for most people. The middle and lower classes worked through December without any days off. There was no time to celebrate unless you were a member of the wealthy upper class. But the Industrial Revolution changed this. The new factories and industries generated enough wealth that middle-class families could finally take time off work and celebrate over 2 days: Christmas Day and Boxing Day. Boxing Day, the day after Christmas, December 26th, and the name tells you everything you need to know about Victorian class structure. The most widely accepted explanation for Boxing Day comes from the Victorian practice of wealthy families giving their servants the day off on December 26th, not Christmas Day, the day after. Because on Christmas Day the servants were working. They were required to cook the elaborate feast, serve the meal, clean up afterward, tend the fires, answer the door, care for the children, and perform every other task that made a proper Victorian Christmas possible for their employers. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, recorded one of the earliest mentions of this practice in 1663. He wrote about sending a coach and messenger to his shoemaker to deliver something to the boy's box against Christmas, along with payment for his bill. The Christmas box, a gift of money, leftover food, or goods given to servants and tradespeople as thanks for their service throughout the year. On December 26th, servants received these boxes and were finally allowed to visit their own families. After spending Christmas Day making someone else's celebration perfect, they got 1 day to have their own Christmas. 1 day. While their employers rested and ate leftovers from the feast the servants had prepared, the aristocracy and elite celebrated Christmas Day. Their servants and stable hands, grooms and livery staff looked forward to celebrating the day after Christmas. Staff would receive Christmas boxes containing gifts, clothing and food from their employers. It is from this tradition that Boxing Day derives its name. Think about what this means. The iconic Victorian Christmas, the one that Charles Dickens wrote about, the one that created our modern traditions, required an entire class of people to sacrifice their own Christmas. The decorated tree? Someone had to bring it inside, set it up and clean up the fallen needles. The elaborate feast? Someone had to shop for ingredients, carry them home, prepare them, cook them for hours and serve them. The beautiful table settings? Someone had to polish every piece of silver, iron every napkin, arrange every decoration. Victorian Christmas was not just a celebration. It was a performance, and every performance requires a crew working behind the scenes. The servants were that crew, invisible in the Christmas cards and the sentimental stories, essential to the entire production. And here is the cruel irony. The Victorian middle class loved to think of themselves as charitable, kind, generous at Christmas. They gave to the poor, they donated to workhouses, they sang carols about peace and goodwill. They read a Christmas carol and felt moved by Scrooge's transformation. But they did not question the system that required their own servants to work on Christmas Day while they celebrated. In fact, they justified it. The Christmas box was presented as generosity. Look how kind we are, giving our servants gifts and a day off. Never mind that the servants had no choice about working on Christmas Day. Never mind that December 26th was not a gift but the bare minimum. A single day of rest after months of grueling labour. The Victorian middle class convinced themselves that giving leftovers and small amounts of money to people they had forced to work on Christmas was charitable. The contrast becomes even starker when you look at what different classes ate on Christmas Day. Queen Victoria's Christmas menu in 1840 included roast beef, roast swan, game pies, boar's head, and dozens of other dishes. Middle-class families enjoyed roast turkey or goose, vegetables, plum pudding, and mince pies. Working-class families who were not in service might have rabbit or a very small goose if they had saved money all year through a goose club, where they put aside small sums regularly to afford the Christmas feast. And the servants? While they cooked the turkey and pudding for their employers, they ate whatever was provided for them. Sometimes it was a decent meal. Often it was basic fare, eaten quickly between tasks, standing up in the kitchen. After the family finished dining, the servants would clear the dishes, wash them, and only then would they be allowed to eat what remained. The children of the rich received handmade toys at the beginning of the Victorian era. These toys were labour-intensive to make and expensive. A doll with a porcelain head and real hair, a rocking horse carved from wood, a clockwork train imported from Germany. As mass production developed, factories produced cheaper toys that middle-class children could afford. Dolls, books, games, tin soldiers. The children of the poor received stockings filled with an apple, an orange, and a few nuts. That was it. An apple, an orange, and some nuts. This tradition began around 1870 and was considered generous. Many poor children received nothing at all. Their parents could not afford to buy gift when they struggled to afford food. An orange was an exotic luxury, imported from Spain or North Africa. For a poor child to receive an orange on Christmas was remarkable. It meant someone had spent money on a treat rather than necessities. Can you imagine the difference? A wealthy child opening presents under a decorated tree surrounded by family, eating until they were stuffed, receiving toys and books and sweets. A poor child receiving one orange and trying to make it last, trying to savour something special in a life defined by scarcity. Both children living in the same country, in the same era, celebrating the same holiday in completely different ways. The Victorian Christmas divided society as clearly as any law. If you could afford a Christmas tree, you were middle class or above. If you could afford a turkey, you had achieved a certain status. If you had servants preparing your meal, you were truly comfortable. And if you were the servant preparing that meal, you were working on Christmas Day. No matter how much your employer talked about the spirit of charity and goodwill, This division was geographic as well as economic. In northern England, roast beef was the traditional Christmas fare. In London and the south, goose was favourite. These regional differences were not quaint variations. They were markers of local economies and available resources. What you ate revealed where you lived and what your income level was. Agricultural labourers, the people who actually grew the food, earned approximately 5 shillings a week. That is 25 pence in modern decimal currency. But to give you a sense of the actual buying power, that was barely enough to feed a family. These workers could never afford to save anything for Christmas. They ate what they always ate. Bread, perhaps some cheese, maybe a bit of bacon if they were fortunate. No turkey, no pudding, no oranges. Meanwhile, turkeys were being walked 80 miles from Norfolk to London, a journey that took weeks. The birds would start in October, their feet fitted with little leather boots to protect them on the long walk. They would arrive in London tired and scrawny, then be fattened up for the final weeks before Christmas. This elaborate process existed entirely to supply Christmas dinners for people who could afford them. The agricultural labourers who raised these turkeys could not afford to eat them. The middle class, however, was determined to celebrate Christmas properly. This was the era when Christmas became a marker of social status. The size and decoration of your tree, the elaborateness of your dinner, the number and quality of gifts you gave, the traditions you practiced, all of it demonstrated your position in society. Christmas was no longer just a religious holiday or a time for family. It was a performance of middle-class identity, and this is where the Victorian invention of Christmas traditions becomes most significant. The middle class needed traditions to perform. They had not simply copied the aristocracy, who had always celebrated lavishly. They needed their own version of Christmas. So they created one, or rather they purchased one. From Germany and from retailers like Woolworth, they bought trees and ornaments and cards and crackers. They bought the performance, but the performance required labour, lots of it. The Victorian Christmas was extraordinarily labour-intensive. A middle-class household might employ 1 or 2 servants. These servants would spend weeks preparing for Christmas, shopping for ingredients, which required multiple trips because there was no refrigeration, preparing the Christmas pudding, which had to be made weeks in advance, cleaning the house from top to bottom, decorating, and then on Christmas Day itself cooking a feast that took hours. The wealthy employed many more servants. A large Victorian household might have a cook, kitchen maids, housemaids, a butler, footman, a lady's maid, a valet, a governess, and outdoor staff including gardeners, stable hands and grooms. All of these people worked on Christmas Day. The cook and kitchen staff spent the entire day preparing food. The butler and footman served the meals and wine. The housemaids tended the fires and cleaned. The outdoor staff cared for the horses and maintained the grounds. These servants lived in the house, usually in small rooms in the attic or basement. They had little privacy and almost no time off. Christmas Day was not exceptional for them, except that they had to work even harder than usual. The one concession was December 26th, Boxing Day, their Christmas. But even Boxing Day was not really a day off. Servants still had to perform essential tasks. The fires still needed tending. The animals still needed feeding. The family still needed basic service. What the servants received on Boxing Day was permission to visit their own families for part of the day, maybe a few hours, maybe the whole day if they were lucky. They received their Christmas box and were sent off with the family's leftovers to share with relatives. Jonathan Swift, the satirist, complained about this custom in 1710. He wrote, "I shall be undone here by Christmas boxes. The rogues at the coffee house have raised their tax, every one giving a crown, and I gave mine for shame, besides a great many half-crowns to great men's porters. Even the wealthy found the custom of Christmas boxes burdensome. They resented having to give money to the people who served them all year, but they did it anyway because it was expected, because it was tradition. There is a Christmas carol that captures this perfectly. Good King Wenceslas. It was written in 1853 by John Mason Neale and reflects the Victorian view of being charitable at Christmas. The lyrics describe King Wenceslas looking out on the Feast of Stephen, which is December 26th, Boxing Day, and seeing a poor man gathering winter fuel in the snow. The king brings the peasant food and wine, trudging through the storm to deliver charity. The carol was beloved by Victorians because it confirmed their view of themselves, the wealthy looking out for the poor, the strong helping the weak, generosity and kindness during the Christmas season. But notice what the carol does not question. Why is the peasant gathering fuel in a snowstorm? Why does he need the king's charity? Why is there such a vast difference in their circumstances that one lives in a castle while the other freezes outside? The Victorian Christmas narrative was always about individual acts of kindness within an unjust system, never about questioning the system itself. Scrooge's transformation in A Christmas Carol is powerful because he becomes personally generous. He gives Bob Cratchit a raise and buys the Cratchit family a turkey. But Scrooge does not wonder why Bob Cratchit was so poorly paid in the first place. He does not question an economy that creates such poverty. He just becomes a kinder version of himself within that economy. This is Victorian Christmas in essence. Individual charity as a substitute for systemic justice. Feeling generous at Christmas while maintaining the structures that create poverty and inequality the rest of the year. Giving your servants a Christmas box and a day off while requiring them to work on Christmas Day. Donating to the workhouse while supporting laws that make the workhouse deliberately harsh to discourage people from seeking help. The Victorian Christmas was two completely different experiences happening simultaneously. The Christmas of the masters and the Christmas of the servants. The Christmas of abundance and the Christmas of scraps. The Christmas of leisure and the Christmas of labour. The Christmas that was photographed and painted and written about, and the Christmas that made all of those things possible but remained invisible. And we inherited both of these Christmases. We inherited the traditions, the decorations, the expectations. We also inherited the idea that Christmas requires enormous amounts of work, usually performed by women, to create the perfect celebration for family and friends. We inherited the notion that Christmas is a performance, something you do correctly or incorrectly based on how well you execute the traditions. What we did not inherit was the servant class to make it all possible. Modern families are expected to create a Victorian Christmas without Victorian servants. We are supposed to shop, decorate, cook, clean, entertain, and create magic, all while maintaining our regular jobs and responsibilities. Is it any wonder that Christmas has become stressful? We're trying to perform a celebration that was designed for people who had staff. The Victorian Christmas looked beautiful in the illustrations and the stories, but behind every decorated tree and elaborate feast were people working, cooking, serving, cleaning, missing their own families, and on December 26th, they finally got to have their own Christmas, with leftovers, and a small box of coins, and the knowledge that they would have to do it all again next year. So when you celebrate Boxing Day, remember what it really represents. Not a quaint British tradition about giving gifts, a day when servants were finally allowed to stop working and spend time with their families, a single day of rest after serving someone else's Christmas. The Victorian Christmas was not one celebration, it was two, and the distance between those two celebrations tells you everything you need to know about Victorian society. The beautiful lie and the harsh truth, the performance and the labour, the masters and the servants. Two Christmases happening in the same country on the same day in completely different worlds, but the class divide extended beyond servants and masters. There was another element of Victorian Christmas that reveals just how deep this division ran, and how the holiday became a tool not just for celebration, but for social control. And that element involves the very darkest aspect of Victorian Christmas, one that Charles Dickens tried to expose but which society preferred to hide behind charity and goodwill. The reality of what Boxing Day meant for the poorest, and what happened when charity was not enough. Here is what Victorian Christmas charity actually looked like. In 1859, a chaplain wrote an article for the Sunday at Home magazine describing Christmas Day in a workhouse. He painted an idyllic picture. "How welcome is Christmas," he wrote, "and how rich and poor rejoice together at its coming. The day of all the year when everyone seems to prepare for and expect enjoyment, and when sorrow seems most out of place. Rich and poor rejoicing together, everyone expecting enjoyment, sorrow out of place." This was published in a religious magazine as fact, as something readers should feel good about. The workhouse Christmas as a heartwarming celebration of British charity and compassion. Now let me tell you what actually happened in that workhouse on Christmas Day, and in hundreds of others across Victorian England. The guardians and their ladies arrived in their furs despite the cold east wind. They had travelled from their comfortable homes to the workhouse specifically to watch the paupers eat. They stood at the edges of the dining hall smiling, being condescending, putting pudding on pauper plates. They were hosts at a banquet they had paid for with the rates, with tax money, not with their own funds, with public money that had been legally mandated, and the paupers sat at tables decorated with garlands of green and holly. The cold, bare walls made bright for the occasion. They had clean-washed hands and faces sitting in a long, hungry line. They said, "Thank you kindly, Mum," and "Thank you kindly, sir," as the wealthy ladies and gentlemen served them portions of roast beef and plum pudding. Meek and lowly, grateful for whatever came. This was Christmas in the workhouse, not charity, theatre, a performance where the wealthy played the role of benevolent benefactors and the poor played the role of grateful recipients, everyone knowing their lines, everyone performing their part. And in 1877, a journalist named George Robert Sims wrote a poem that tore the mask off this performance. It was called Christmas Day in the Workhouse, and it sold over 100,000 copies within a year of publication. 100,000. People could not get enough of it. The poem was recited in music halls, parlours and public gatherings across England. For a time, it was the most performed recitation in the English language. Why? Because Sims told the truth. He took the idyllic magazine descriptions of workhouse Christmas and showed what they really meant. His poem begins with those same decorations, those same smiling guardians. It is Christmas Day in the workhouse, and the cold, bare walls are bright with garlands of green and holly, and the place is a pleasant sight. But then an old man refuses the Christmas pudding. He pushes his plate aside. The guardians are horrified. The master's face goes white. Did a pauper refuse the pudding? Could their ears believe aright? The ladies clutch their husbands, thinking the man would die, struck by a bolt from God for this ingratitude, and the old man tells them why. The previous Christmas, his wife Nance was starving. They had been married for 50 years. They had been a Devon trader and his wife, living an honest working life. But poverty had found them in old age. For the first time, the old man went to the workhouse to beg for food. He was told that food would not be given out. If they wanted to eat, they would have to come inside the workhouse and stay. His wife refused. She would not be separated from her husband of 50 years on Christmas Day. Because that is what the workhouse did. Families were split up. Men, women, and children were housed separately. They were not allowed to communicate with one another, even in communal areas. A couple married for half a century would be torn apart at the workhouse doors, so they stayed in their freezing room. The old man watched his wife all through Christmas Eve, holding her hand, praying and weeping. He asked her once if she was hungry, and she said no. The moon shone in at the window, set in a wreath of snow. The room was bathed in moonlight, and he saw in her eyes the faraway look that comes when the spirit flies. She began to rave about their home in Devon, where their happiest years had been spent. She talked like the country lass he had courted by the Devon shore. Then she rose to her feet, trembled, and fell on the rags, moaning. "Give me a crust. I am famished. For the love of God," she groaned. The old man rushed from the room like a madman and flew to the workhouse gate, crying, "Food for a dying woman!" And the answer came, too late. They drove him away with curses. He fought with a dog in the street and tore from the mongrel's clutches a crust the dog was trying to eat. He brought this crust back to his wife, but she was dead. She had starved to death on Christmas Eve because the workhouse would not give food to people who refused to come inside and be separated from their loved ones. And now, 1 year later, this old man sits in the workhouse dining hall, watching the guardians in their furs smile and put pudding on plates, and he refuses to eat. "I eat not the food of villains whose hands are foul and red," he tells them, whose victims cry for vengeance from their dark, unhallowed graves. The workhouse master says the man must be drunk or mad. "Not drunk or mad," the pauper replies, "but only a hunted beast who, torn by the hounds and mangled, declines the vulture's feast." This poem was not subtle, it was not polite. It called the guardians villains with blood on their hands. It called their Christmas charity a vulture's feast, and 100,000 people bought it. Hundreds of thousands more heard it recited. It was reprinted in newspapers, magazines, and books. It became the most famous criticism of the workhouse system ever written. And here is what makes this fascinating. The details in Sim's poem were not entirely accurate. The poor law regulations actually did permit old couples to cohabit in some circumstances. Short-term relief could be given out in emergency situations. But the emotional truth of the poem was so powerful that the factual inaccuracies did not matter. People knew from their own observations and experiences that the poem captured something real about the workhouse system. The cruelty, the separation of families, the humiliation, the performance of charity that was really just another form of punishment. Because that is what the new poor law of 1834 was designed to do. Punish poverty, make relief so unpleasant that people would do anything to avoid it. The law explicitly prohibited workhouses from serving plum pudding and roast beef at Christmas. These were the core parts of an English festive meal, and the Poor Law Commission declared that such food should not be wasted on paupers. The Lancaster Gazette published an outraged response in 1836. "Shame! We positively dread the working of the new poor law." By 1834, serving roast beef at Christmas had become an established prerogative of even the poorest English people. Taking it away was seen as a violation of basic human dignity. But the guardians eventually relented, not out of compassion, but because Christmas charity became a way for the middle class to perform their own virtue. As one historian put it, the workhouse Christmas gradually became the cultural domain of the middle classes. It was their chance to demonstrate benevolence, hospitality, and domesticity. The quintessentially British values they believed defined them. So workhouses were allowed to provide Christmas dinners, but only if the money came from private donations. Victorian taxpayers were certainly not going to pay for Christmas for the poor. Wealthy individuals had to donate the roast beef and pudding, and in exchange for their donations they got to attend the workhouse on Christmas Day and watch the paupers eat. The Times newspaper published regular reviews from 1840 to 1870 of how inmates were treated at Christmas in workhouses around London. These articles describe the decorations, the food, the grateful poor, and the generous guardians. They made Workhouse Christmas sound delightful. The Richmond Herald reported in 1896 that inmates at the Richmond Workhouse received 200 weight of beef, about 91 kilograms, and the same amount of plum pudding on Christmas Day. 200 weight of beef. That sounds generous, does it not? Until you remember that this was being divided among hundreds of inmates, and that it was one meal, one day a year, and that for the other 364 days, these same people ate the bare minimum. Gruel, bread, occasionally some cheese, no meat, no pudding, no treats of any kind. Victorian Christmas charity was a performance with a script everyone knew. The wealthy would arrive at the workhouse dressed in their finest. They would smile and serve food. The poor would express gratitude. Newspapers would report on the heartwarming scenes. The middle class would read these reports and feel good about their society's compassion. Everyone would forget about the workhouse for another year. But this performance required the poor to play along, to be meek and lowly, to say, "Thank you kindly, Mum," no matter what they actually felt, to accept that one day of slightly better food somehow compensated for a year of degradation and suffering, to pretend that the guardians who forced families apart and made the workhouse deliberately miserable were also generous benefactors spreading Christmas cheer. George Robert Sims' poem was so shocking because it showed a pauper who refused to play his role, who spoke the truth, who called the performance exactly what it was. And when that happened, when the mask slipped, the guardians and ladies were horrified. How dare a pauper be ungrateful? How dare he refuse the pudding? How dare he speak truth to the very people who had caused his wife to starve? Sims was a campaigning journalist who had investigated London's East End slums. He wrote exposés about overcrowding, disease and poverty for newspapers, including the Weekly Dispatch, the Pictorial World, and the Daily News, which had been founded by Charles Dickens. In 1881, he and illustrator Frederick Barnard wrote a series of articles called How the Poor Live for a new journal, the Pictorial World. These were published in book form in 1883 and became required reading for anyone who wanted to understand the reality of urban poverty. But it was the poem that made Sims famous. Its melodramatic, sentimental style was perfectly suited to Victorian sensibilities. People loved dramatic recitations. They loved stories that made them feel something, and Christmas Day in the workhouse made them feel outrage, compassion, guilt. All the emotions that the sanitized newspaper reports about Workhouse Christmas tried to avoid. One social reformer later declared that reading Christmas Day in the Workhouse started him on his campaign for old age pensions, a campaign he lived to see crowned with victory. The poem did not single-handedly change the poor law system, but it contributed to a growing public awareness that something was deeply wrong with how Victorian England treated its poor, and yet the Workhouse Christmas performance continued, because it served a purpose. It allowed the middle class to feel charitable without actually changing anything. They could donate money for one Christmas dinner and feel they had done their duty. They could attend the workhouse and watch the grateful poor and congratulate themselves on their compassion. They could read about it in newspapers and believe that England took care of its less fortunate citizens. Meanwhile, families were still being separated. The elderly were still being stripped of their possessions and dressed in coarse uniforms. Children were still being taken from their parents. The able-bodied were still being forced to work long hours at pointless tasks designed to break their spirit. The sick were still dying in workhouse infirmaries with minimal medical care. All of this continued, 365 days a year, but on Christmas Day the guardians came in their furs, the walls were decorated with holly, pudding was put on pauper plates, and everyone pretended this was charity. The church played its own role in this performance. Throughout December, churches placed alms boxes near the altar where parishioners could deposit donations. On December 26th, Boxing Day, these boxes would be opened and the money distributed to the poor. This was presented as an ancient Christian tradition of caring for those in need, but think about what this actually meant. The same people who supported the harsh poor law, who voted for guardians who deliberately made the workhouse miserable, who believed poverty was a moral failing, these people would drop coins in a church box and feel virtuous. The same system that starved paupers all year would give them a few shillings on Boxing Day and call it charity. St. Stephen, whose feast day falls on December 26th, was known for his charitable works. He distributed alms to the poor, and the carol Good King Wenceslas, written in 1853, celebrated this spirit of Boxing Day charity. The king looking out, seeing a poor man gathering winter fuel, bringing him food and logs, the rich helping the poor, everyone feeling good about the story. But the carol never asked why the peasant was gathering fuel in a snowstorm, why he was poor in the first place, why he needed the king's charity to survive. It presented individual acts of kindness as the solution, never questioning the system that created such vast inequality. This was Victorian Christmas charity, individual kindness within an unjust system, feeling generous without changing anything fundamental, performing compassion while maintaining structures of oppression, decorating the workhouse with holly while families starved on the other side of town. And the most insidious part, it worked. The Victorian middle class genuinely believed they were charitable. They pointed to the Christmas dinners, the Boxing Day donations, the church collections. Look how kind we are, they said. Look how we care for our poor. We are a Christian nation. We practice the values of compassion and benevolence. They read Charles Dickens and felt moved by Scrooge's transformation. They wept at the plight of Tiny Tim. They donated to Christmas charities. They gave their servants Christmas boxes. They attended workhouse dinners and smiled at the grateful paupers. And they never, not for one moment, questioned whether the system itself was wrong. Because questioning the system would have required them to give up more than a few coins or one Christmas dinner. It would have required them to examine their own role in creating and maintaining poverty. It would have required them to share power, not just pudding. It would have required actual sacrifice, not just performance. Victorian Christmas charity was not about helping the poor. It was about making the wealthy feel better about being wealthy. It was a way to manage guilt without changing behaviour, a way to perform virtue without practicing justice, a way to celebrate Christmas while maintaining the very structures that made Christmas impossible for so many. George Robert Sims understood this. His poem stripped away the decorations and the smiles and showed what was really happening. An old man whose wife had starved to death because the workhouse refused to help them unless they agreed to be separated. Guardians who cared more about preventing fraud than preventing death. A system that valued money over human life and called it prudence. A society that confused charity with justice and performance with compassion. The poem ends with the old man collapsing into tears, haunted by the memory of his wife's death. The guardians and ladies stand frozen, shocked by his outburst. The other paupers tremble in silence. The performance has been interrupted. The truth has been spoken. And for just a moment everyone sees the workhouse Christmas for exactly what it is. But moments pass, performances resume. The guardians would return to their homes, the paupers would return to their gruel, the system would continue. Because Victorian Christmas was never about changing things. It was about feeling good while keeping everything exactly the same. And this pattern, this performance of charity instead of practice of justice, this substitution of individual kindness for systemic change, we inherited this too. We inherited the idea that charity at Christmas absolves us of responsibility the rest of the year. That donating to food banks makes up for accepting an economy that creates food insecurity. That feeling generous is the same as being just. The Victorians did not invent inequality, but they perfected the performance of caring about it while maintaining it. They created Christmas as we know it, traditions and decorations and sentiment, and they also created Christmas charity as we know it, the performance that lets us feel good without changing anything fundamental. So the next time you donate to a Christmas charity, ask yourself, am I helping because I want to change the system that creates need? Or am I performing virtue to make myself feel better? Am I practicing justice? Or am I decorating the workhouse with holly while families still starve? Victorian Christmas was two celebrations, the Christmas of abundance and the Christmas of scraps, the Christmas of performance and the Christmas of suffering. And between those two Christmases was charity, not as a bridge, but as a veil, a beautiful performance that let everyone pretend the divide did not exist. But the divide did exist. It was real, it was deliberate, and it was maintained by the very people who congratulated themselves on their Christmas generosity. And speaking of that divide, there is one more element of Victorian Christmas we need to examine. Something even darker than the workhouse performance. Something that reveals just how deeply the class system penetrated every aspect of Victorian life, even in the one season that was supposed to be about peace and goodwill. The final truth about what Christmas really meant when you were at the very bottom of Victorian society. While Victorian families gathered around their fireplaces on Christmas morning, opening presents and singing carols, there were children inside those fireplaces, literally inside them, climbing through the dark, narrow chimneys that made those cozy Christmas fires possible. Children as young as 4 years old, purchased from poverty-stricken parents who had too many mouths to feed. Children who would never experience Christmas, who would die, on average, before they turned 25. This is the part of Victorian Christmas that no greeting card ever showed. The children who made Christmas possible for others but had no Christmas of their own. Let me be very specific about what chimney sweeping actually involved. The Great Fire of London in 1666 led to chimneys being rebuilt narrower and more winding to minimise fire risk. These new chimneys were only 18 inches wide. 18 inches, that is 46 centimetres. A space so small that only children could fit through them. And not just any children, small children, malnourished children, children whose growth had been deliberately stunted by bosses who underfed them so they would remain thin enough to continue working. These children were not employees. They were not even paid apprentices in any meaningful sense. They were purchased. Parents sold them in a one-time transaction. The child received no pay for their work. They were given a blanket for collecting debris, which usually doubled as their filthy bedding. That was it. No wages, no education, no future. Just a blanket and the promise of brutal labour for as long as their small bodies could fit into chimneys. The first several times a child went down a chimney, their arms, elbows, legs and knees would be rubbed and scraped raw against the rough brick. Sometimes there appeared to be no skin left on these joints at all. The master sweep would wash their wounds with salt water and send them down another chimney without sympathy, without rest, without mercy. Eventually the child would develop calluses thick enough to make the work slightly more bearable, but only slightly. The actual experience of climbing was terrifying. Chimney flues were pitch black, claustrophobic and confusing to navigate. A child would climb from the hearth to the rooftop, cleaning as they went. But when they exited onto the roof, they might forget which chimney they had come out of. Victorian houses often had multiple chimneys close together. If the child went back down the wrong chimney, or took a wrong turn at a merging of flues, they could get lost. They could suffocate. They could burn to death by accidentally entering a chimney that was still hot. There were documented cases of children getting stuck in chimneys with no one knowing. They died alone from exposure, smoke inhalation, or something worse that I will leave to your imagination. Can you conceive of a more terrifying death? Stuck in absolute darkness, unable to move, unable to call for help, slowly running out of air while a family sits in the room below, completely unaware. And this was happening on Christmas Day. Because Christmas Day was when wealthy families wanted their chimneys cleanest, when they wanted their fireplaces working perfectly for the holiday gathering. So while parents and children exchanged gifts and ate turkey and sang carols around those beautiful warming fires, there were children inside the chimneys, working, bleeding, dying. The constant breathing of soot caused irreversible lung damage. But there was something even worse. In 1775, a doctor named Percival Pott described a condition he called chimney sweep's cancer. It was scrotal carcinoma, caused by soot embedding in the skin. The condition was excruciatingly painful and always fatal. There was no treatment. Pott wrote that these boys were most frequently treated with great brutality and were almost starved with hunger and cold. Their fate, he wrote, was singularly hard. Parliament passed laws. In 1788, the minimum age for chimney sweep apprentices was set at 8 years old. The law was ignored. In 1834, another act raised the minimum age to 14. Still ignored. In 1840, the minimum age of apprenticeship was raised to 16. Completely ignored. Children as young as 4 continued to be sent up chimneys for another 40 years. Why were the laws ignored? Because enforcement was essentially non-existent. The entire textile industry, iron and coal mines, gasworks, shipyards, construction, match factories and chimney sweeping were monitored by a total of 4 inspectors for all of England. 4 inspectors for millions of child labourers. The laws were theatre, another performance of virtue without substance. In 1875, a 12-year-old boy named George Brewster died after his master sweep made him climb the chimney at Fulbourn Hospital to clean it. He got stuck and suffocated. His death finally prompted Lord Shaftesbury to propose a new act that actually worked. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 required all sweeps to be registered with police and made enforcement the duty of law enforcement rather than non-existent inspectors. 1875. The law finally worked in 1875. That means for the entire Victorian era until then, for all those decades of Christmas celebrations and decorated trees and elaborate feasts, children were dying in chimneys. Not occasionally, regularly, predictably, and everyone knew. Everyone. Charles Kingsley wrote The Water Babies in 1863, a novel about a chimney sweep child named Tom, specifically to raise public awareness. The book was popular. People read it. People felt moved by it. And then they went back to hiring chimney sweeps who used children, because the alternative was using brushes. Chimney sweeping could be done more safely and just as effectively using brushes on long poles. No children necessary. But master chimney sweeps claimed in evidence to a House of Commons committee in 1819 that they would lose custom if they used machines. Households wanted the personal service of a sweep. They wanted the traditional method. They wanted what they had always known. What they had always known meant sending 4-year-olds up chimneys. But households did not have to see that part. The children came early in the morning before the family was awake. They came through the servants' entrance. They did their work inside the walls, invisible. And then they left, still invisible, covered head to toe in soot. The family would wake to clean chimneys and perfect fireplaces, never having to confront the small bleeding child who made their comfort possible. This invisibility was crucial to Victorian Christmas. The celebration required enormous amounts of invisible labour. We've talked about servants working while families celebrated, but there were others. Match girls, some as young as 5 years old, working in factories with white phosphorus that caused a condition called phossy jaw. Their jawbones would literally rot away from exposure to the chemicals. They worked on Christmas Day because match production could not stop. Families needed matches to light their Christmas candles and fires. Street sellers, children as young as 6 or 7, selling oranges, nuts, holly and mistletoe on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Standing in the cold for hours, hoping to earn enough pennies to avoid a beating from whoever controlled them. No warm house to return to. No Christmas dinner waiting. Just the street and the cold and the endless need to sell something, anything, to survive. Factory workers, children included, who operated dangerous machinery making toys for wealthy children's Christmas presents. Fingers crushed in gears, arms broken in accidents. All so that a child in a comfortable home could unwrap a wooden train or a tin soldier on Christmas morning, never knowing that another child had been maimed making it. Coal miners, boys and girls starting at age 5, working underground in absolute darkness, pulling carts of coal through tunnels so low they had to crawl. The coal that heated the homes where Christmas was celebrated. The coal that powered the factories that made Christmas possible. Extracted by children who would likely die before age 25 from lung disease, accidents, or simple exhaustion. Farm workers, children who worked the land that grew the food for Christmas feasts. Potatoes, carrots, Brussels sprouts, all harvested by small hands in cold fields. These children had no holiday. December 25th was a work day like any other. The turkeys and geese had to be tended. The vegetables had to be stored. The work never stopped. And here is what makes this unbearable. These were not children from different countries or distant places. These were English children, living in the same cities where Christmas was celebrated so elaborately, sometimes living on the same streets. Sometimes they were the children of the servants who prepared the Christmas feast. Orphans, illegitimate children, children whose parents could not afford to feed them, children who simply had the misfortune of being born poor. The Victorian Christmas that we inherited, with all its traditions and warmth and sentiment, was built on the labour of these children. The decorated tree stood in a warm room heated by chimneys that children had just climbed. The Christmas candles were made by children who would develop phossy jaw. The holly and mistletoe were sold by children who slept in doorways. The toys were made by children who had no toys of their own. The feast was grown and harvested and transported by children who were hungry, and Victorian society knew. They published exposés, they passed laws, they wrote novels, they expressed concern. But they did not stop buying from chimney sweeps who used children. They did not stop purchasing from match factories that employed 5-year-olds. They did not stop the entire system of child labour that made their comfortable Christmas possible. Because stopping would have required sacrifice. Real sacrifice. It would have meant paying more for goods and services. It would have meant accepting less convenience. It would have meant confronting uncomfortable truths about where Christmas actually came from. It would have meant admitting that their beautiful celebration was soaked in children's blood. So instead, they performed concern. They donated to orphanages at Christmas. They gave toys to poor children, tokens of charity that changed nothing about the system. They sang carols about peace and goodwill while employing children in conditions that would make us weep. They celebrated the birth of the Christ child while sending actual children to die in chimneys. The contrast was not accidental. The Victorian middle class needed that contrast. They needed to see themselves as charitable, as good, as morally superior. and the best way to feel morally superior was to give a toy or a coin to a poor child at Christmas. "Look how kind we are," they could say. "Look how we care for children. Never mind the children dying in our chimneys. Never mind the children with rotting jaws making our matches. Never mind the children in mines who would never see daylight. We gave a toy to an orphan at Christmas. We are good people." This is the mechanism of Victorian Christmas charity. Individual acts of kindness that obscure systemic cruelty. Moments of generosity that excuse ongoing exploitation. A performance of virtue that requires no actual change in behavior or structure. Give with one hand while taking with the other. Feel good about the giving while pretending the taking does not exist. And we inherited this too. We inherited the ability to feel charitable while participating in systems that harm children. We buy products made by child labour in other countries and feel good about donating toys at Christmas. We celebrate abundance while accepting that children somewhere are suffering to make that abundance possible. We perform the same separation the Victorians perfected. The children who make our comfortable life possible are invisible, distant, easy to forget. The charity we perform is visible, close, easy to feel good about. The Victorian child chimney sweep is romanticised now. Mary Poppins turned them into dancing, cheerful characters singing about luck and soot. The image is charming, picturesque. Part of the quaint Victorian London that we imagine was all gas lamps and Christmas cheer. But the reality was a 4-year-old child being lowered into a black hole, knowing that if they got stuck, they would die alone and afraid. The reality was children whose arms and legs were raw meat from scraping against brick. The reality was a 12-year-old boy named George Brewster suffocating in a hospital chimney in 1875 because his master needed the money. On Christmas Day, 1874, 1 year before George Brewster died, Victorian families were celebrating the holiday with all the traditions we still recognise: trees, ornaments, cards, crackers, feasts. Charles Dickens had been dead for 4 years, but A Christmas Carol was still beloved. Families read it aloud, feeling moved by Tiny Tim and Scrooge's transformation. They felt the Christmas spirit, that warm glow of goodwill and charity. And while they felt that warm glow, children were in their chimneys, working on Christmas Day, bleeding on Christmas Day, some of them dying on Christmas Day, making that warm glow possible. That is Victorian Christmas. Not the version on the cards or in the stories, the real version. The version where the beauty and warmth and tradition all rest on a foundation of suffering so vast and so cruel that we can barely comprehend it today. Child labour, child suffering, child death. Systematic, deliberate, accepted. And when we celebrate Christmas using Victorian traditions, when we decorate our trees and sing their carols and exchange gifts using their customs, we are celebrating a holiday that was designed, marketed, and perfected by people who sent 4-year-olds up chimneys. That does not mean we should stop celebrating, but it does mean we should remember. We should know the truth about what we inherited. We should understand that the beautiful Victorian Christmas came with a cost, and that cost was paid by children. Because if we do not remember, if we do not understand the truth, then we are likely to repeat the same pattern. We are likely to perform charity while accepting cruelty. We are likely to feel good about giving toys while ignoring the children who suffer to make our comfortable lives possible. We are likely to inherit not just Victorian Christmas traditions, but Victorian Christmas morality. The kind of morality that could write, "Peace on earth, goodwill to men," on a Christmas card and then send a child up a chimney. The Victorians gave us Christmas, but they also showed us how to celebrate without seeing, how to feel generous without being just, how to create beauty while accepting cruelty, how to perform virtue while maintaining vice. And perhaps that lesson, That dark lesson about the human capacity for selective blindness is the most important thing Victorian Christmas has to teach us. Still, there is one final piece of this story, one more element of Victorian Christmas that pulls all of these threads together and shows us exactly how this system worked, how the beautiful myth and the brutal reality coexisted, how an entire society convinced itself that everything was fine, how Christmas itself became not just a celebration but a tool, and that final revelation is waiting just ahead. Now we arrive at the most uncomfortable truth of all. Victorian Christmas was not just built on inequality and suffering, it was designed to maintain that inequality, to make it acceptable, to make it feel right. Christmas was not just a celebration that happened to coexist with brutal exploitation. Christmas was a tool that made the exploitation possible. Let me show you how this worked. In 1837, when Queen Victoria took the throne, England was on the edge of revolution. The Industrial Revolution had created unprecedented wealth for factory owners and unprecedented misery for workers. Cities were overcrowded, disease-ridden, and volatile. The Chartist movement was demanding political reform. Workers were organising. The middle and upper classes were genuinely afraid that England might follow France into violent upheaval. They needed something to calm the population, to create a sense of social cohesion, to make people accept their place in the rigid class hierarchy. They needed a shared cultural experience that would make rich and poor feel like they were part of the same society, even as that society treated them completely differently. They needed Christmas. Before the Victorian era, Christmas was barely celebrated by most English people. It was just another day for the working classes, who had no time off and no extra money. The wealthy celebrated privately, but there was no national Christmas culture, no shared traditions, no universal sentiment, nothing that bound society together across class lines. The Victorians changed all of that, and they did it deliberately, strategically, brilliantly. First, they made Christmas about family and home, the decorated tree in the parlor, the family gathered around the fire, children opening presents. These images appeared everywhere, in magazines, newspapers, illustrations, and stories. The message was clear. Christmas happens at home, with family, not in the streets, not in public gatherings where workers might organize, not in taverns where revolutionary ideas might spread. At home, private, domestic, safe. This was a radical shift. Previous Christmas celebrations had been rowdy, public affairs, drinking in the streets, parties that lasted days, behaviours that made the middle class very uncomfortable. The Victorians domesticated Christmas. They moved it from the dangerous public sphere into the controlled private sphere, and in doing so they made it less threatening. Second, they made Christmas about children. Tiny Tim became the symbol of Christmas, not adult workers demanding fair wages, not political reformers calling for change, a sick child who needed charity. This was genius, because when you make Christmas about children, you make it about innocence, about sentiment, about emotion rather than justice. Think about how A Christmas Carol works. Scrooge is redeemed not by recognizing that he underpays Bob Cratchit, not by acknowledging systemic economic inequality, but by feeling sorry for Tiny Tim, by becoming personally generous. The story never questions why Bob Cratchit is paid so little in the first place. It never suggests that workers should organise for better wages. It never challenges the economic system that creates poverty. Instead, it suggests that if rich people just become a bit kinder, a bit more generous, everything will be fine. The system can stay exactly as it is. We just need rich people to have bigger hearts. This is not a revolutionary message. This is a conservative message dressed up as compassion. Charles Dickens, for all his genuine concern about poverty, gave the Victorian middle class exactly what they needed. A way to feel good about themselves without changing anything fundamental. A way to perform charity without practicing justice. A way to celebrate Christmas while maintaining the very system that made Christmas impossible for so many. And it worked. A Christmas Carol became the most influential Christmas story ever written. It defined how we think about Christmas. It taught us that individual generosity is the solution to poverty, that personal transformation matters more than political reform, that feeling compassionate is more important than creating justice. Third, the Victorians made Christmas spectacular. The elaborate decorations, the abundant feasts, the expensive gifts. This served a crucial purpose. It demonstrated that the system was working. Look at how prosperous we are, they could say. Look at what we can afford. Our economic system creates such wealth that we can celebrate like this. Forget the children in the chimneys and the families in the workhouse. Look at this beautiful tree. Look at this magnificent feast. England is thriving. The Christmas feast became propaganda. Every roast turkey demonstrated the success of British agriculture and trade. Every imported orange proved the reach of the British Empire. Every glass ornament from Germany showed the benefits of international commerce. The Christmas table was a political statement disguised as a holiday meal. And what about the working class? They were given just enough to participate. Not enough to truly celebrate as the wealthy did, but enough to feel included. A day off work. A small Christmas dinner if they could afford it. Perhaps a Christmas box from their employer. Just enough to make them feel that they too are part of this grand national celebration. Just enough to prevent them from questioning why they had so little, while others had so much. This is the genius of it. Christmas created the illusion of shared culture while maintaining rigid class divisions. Rich and poor both celebrated Christmas, but in completely different ways. The rich had elaborate feasts and expensive gifts. The poor had bread and an orange. But both could say they celebrated Christmas. Both could feel part of English Christmas tradition. The differences in how they celebrated simply reflected the natural order of things. The deserving rich and the unfortunate poor, all part of God's plan. The church reinforced this message. Sermons at Christmas emphasize contentment, gratitude, and accepting one's lot in life. The poor were told to be grateful for what they had, to thank God for their daily bread, to accept their poverty as part of divine will. The rich were told to be charitable, to remember those less fortunate, to give generously at Christmas. But never ever were people told to question the system itself. This is why Boxing Day charity was so important. It allowed the wealthy to feel virtuous while maintaining their wealth. It allowed the poor to receive help while accepting their poverty. Everyone played their role. Everyone stayed in their place. And Christmas made it all feel right and good and proper. The Victorian Christmas also taught people to focus on individual morality rather than systemic problems. Were you generous at Christmas? Did you give to charity? Did you attend church? Did you treat your servants kindly on Christmas Day? These became the questions that mattered. Not, why are children working in factories? Why are families separated in workhouses? Why do agricultural workers earn starvation wages? Not the systemic questions, just the individual, personal, moral questions. This individualization of morality is perhaps Victorian Christmas's most lasting legacy. We still think this way. We still judge ourselves and others based on individual generosity rather than support for systemic change. We still think that buying toys for poor children at Christmas makes us good people, regardless of whether we support policies that keep those children poor. We still perform the Victorian separation between personal virtue and political responsibility, and Christmas taught people to think temporally rather than structurally. Christmas was one day of abundance, generosity, and goodwill. The rest of the year could be business as usual. Exploitation, harsh working conditions, grinding poverty, all acceptable for 364 days. But on Christmas, everyone was kind, everyone was generous, everyone felt the Christmas spirit. This temporal separation allowed people to maintain contradictory beliefs. I am a good person because I am kind at Christmas. I am a practical person because I am tough the rest of the year. I can be generous on December 25th and ruthless on December 26th. I can give my servants Christmas boxes and then work them to exhaustion for the next 12 months. Christmas and the rest of the year existed in separate moral universes. The Victorian Christmas also created a powerful mythology about England itself. Christmas became a marker of English identity. English Christmas was special. English Christmas was the best Christmas. The rest of the world was copying English traditions. This fed into a broader narrative about English superiority, about English civilization, about the righteousness of English imperialism. If England could create such beautiful Christmas traditions, clearly England was a superior culture. Clearly the English had special virtues. Clearly they deserved to rule an empire. Christmas became evidence of moral superiority, and that moral superiority justified everything else. The exploitation of colonies, the brutal working conditions in factories, the harsh poor laws. All of this was acceptable because England was civilized enough to create beautiful Christmases. Do you see how perfect this system was? Christmas made people feel good about a society that was fundamentally unjust. It created shared cultural experiences that masked enormous inequality. It taught people to think about individual morality rather than systemic justice. It domesticated and depoliticized what could have been a dangerous season of potential unrest. It turned potential revolutionary energy into sentiment and nostalgia, and it worked so well that we still do it. We still use Christmas the way the Victorians taught us to use it. We still focus on individual generosity rather than systemic justice. We still perform one day of goodwill while accepting 364 days of inequality. We still judge ourselves by whether we donate to charity rather than whether we support policies that would eliminate the need for charity. We still separate the beautiful celebration from the ugly exploitation that makes it possible. We still consume products made by poorly paid workers and feel good about ourselves because we donated toys at Christmas. We still celebrate abundance while accepting scarcity for others. We still do exactly what the Victorians did. We just do it with better technology and more sophisticated marketing, because Victorian Christmas was not abolished or reformed. It was exported. It spread throughout the English-speaking world and beyond. American Christmas, Canadian Christmas, Australian Christmas, all based on the Victorian model. The same traditions, the same sentiments, the same underlying structure that privileges feeling over action, individual charity over systemic justice, performance over substance. The Victorian Christmas is the Christmas we celebrate. When we sing Victorian carols, we are singing songs written to make people feel content with their place in an unjust hierarchy. When we send Victorian-style cards, we are participating in a commercial ritual designed to demonstrate middle-class status. When we gather around a decorated tree, we're recreating a domestic scene specifically crafted to keep people at home rather than organizing politically. I am not saying we should stop celebrating Christmas. I am saying we should understand what we are celebrating. We should know the history. We should recognize the mechanisms. We should see how Christmas was used as a tool of social control, because if we do not see it, we cannot resist it. If we do not understand how Victorian Christmas worked, we will continue to fall into the same patterns. The Victorian Christmas solved a problem for the Victorian ruling class. How do you maintain a grossly unequal society in an age of increasing democratic sentiment? How do you prevent revolution when conditions are revolutionary? How do you make people accept their exploitation? You give them Christmas. You give them one day of beauty and warmth and abundance. You give them traditions that make them feel connected to something larger than themselves. You give them sentiment and nostalgia and the warm glow of generosity. You give them just enough to make them forget for one day how little they have the rest of the year, and then you teach them that this is enough, that this is good, that this is how things should be, that individual kindness matters more than political change, that feeling generous is the same as being just, that Christmas charity absolves them of responsibility for the system they benefit from and maintain. This was the Victorian achievement, not the trees or the cards or the crackers. Those were just decorations. The real achievement was creating a holiday that made people feel good about an unjust society, that channeled potentially revolutionary energy into harmless sentiment, that substituted performance for substance and called it virtue, and it worked so perfectly that we still do not see it. We still think Victorian Christmas was about kindness and generosity and family values. We still think Dickens was a radical calling for change rather than a reformer making exploitation more palatable. We still think Christmas charity is the solution rather than a distraction from the problem. We still celebrate the Victorian Christmas without understanding that it was designed to make us celebrate rather than organize, to make us feel rather than think, to make us perform individual virtue rather than demand systemic justice, to make us accept inequality by wrapping it in sentiment and nostalgia and beautiful traditions. The children in the chimneys, the families in the workhouses, the servants working while masters celebrated, the agricultural workers who could not afford the food they grew, the factory children making toys for wealthy children. All of this was not accidental or unfortunate. It was systematic. It was maintained. And Christmas helped maintain it by making people feel good about themselves despite it. That is the dark genius of Victorian Christmas. It made people complicit in exploitation while feeling virtuous. It turned potential anger into sentiment. It channeled energy that could have changed the system into performances that maintained it. It gave people just enough illusion of shared culture to prevent them from recognizing just how completely separate their experiences actually were. And when we celebrate Victorian Christmas today without understanding this history, we risk doing the same thing. We risk using Christmas to make ourselves feel good about inequality rather than to confront it. We risk performing charity while accepting injustice. We risk focusing on individual acts of kindness while ignoring systemic cruelty. The Victorian Christmas is not just history, it is still happening. Every time we donate to charity at Christmas and think that makes us good people, while supporting policies that create poverty, we are performing the Victorian Christmas. Every time we focus on individual generosity rather than systemic change, we're thinking Victorian thoughts. Every time we celebrate abundance while accepting that others have scarcity, we're living Victorian values. The Victorians created Christmas as we know it, but they also created a model for how to use celebration as control, how to use sentiment as a substitute for justice, how to use tradition to maintain inequality, how to use culture as a weapon while calling it a gift. And that brings us to the final question, the question that all of this history compels us to ask. Now that we know the truth about Victorian Christmas, now that we understand how it worked and why it was created, what do we do? Do we reject it, reform it, redeem it? Can Victorian Christmas be separated from Victorian values, or is the holiday itself inseparable from the injustice it was designed to maintain? That final reckoning is what remains. So here we are, after 12 parts and more than 2 hours together, We have seen the truth about Victorian Christmas. We have watched it be invented, marketed, and sold. We have seen the servants working while masters celebrated. We have seen the workhouse performance and the charity theatre. We have seen children dying in chimneys to keep Christmas fires burning. We have seen how a holiday was weaponized to maintain inequality while feeling like kindness. And now you know. You cannot unknow it. Every Christmas from this point forward you will remember. When you see a Victorian Christmas card, you will think about the child labour that made such leisure possible. When you watch A Christmas Carol, you will notice that Scrooge becomes personally generous but never questions the economic system. When you decorate a tree, you will remember that this tradition was imported and commercialised deliberately. When you perform Christmas charity, you will wonder whether you are helping or just performing. So what do we do with this knowledge? Some people, when they learn difficult truths about beloved traditions, want to reject those traditions entirely. Burn it all down. Christmas is tainted by its Victorian origins, they might say, so we should abandon it completely. Start fresh. Create something new that is not built on exploitation and lies. I understand that impulse. I truly do. But I do not think that is the answer. Because here is what I have learned researching and writing this series. Every human celebration, every cultural tradition, every holiday we cherish, if you dig deep enough, you will find exploitation and inequality and suffering. There is no pure tradition. There is no celebration with completely clean hands. Humanity has always been both beautiful and terrible. We have always created meaning alongside cruelty. The question is not whether our traditions are tainted. They are. The question is what we do with that knowledge. We can reject Victorian Christmas without rejecting Christmas itself. We can keep the parts that bring genuine joy and connection, while abandoning the parts that serve injustice. We can reclaim Christmas from the Victorians. We can make it mean something different, something better. Let me be specific about what this might look like. First, we can celebrate Christmas with our eyes open. We can acknowledge the history. We can tell our children the truth, not the sanitized version where Dickens saved Christmas and everyone lived happily ever after. The real version. The version where Christmas was created by people who sent 4-year-olds up chimneys. The version where charity was performance and inequality was systematic. This does not mean making Christmas depressing. It means making Christmas honest. When we tell the story of A Christmas Carol, we can also tell the story of George Robert Sims' poem about the workhouse. When we talk about Victorian Christmas traditions, we can talk about the servants who made them possible. When we light candles on our tree, we can remember the match girls with phossy jaw, not to ruin Christmas, but to honour the truth, to see the full picture. Second, we can redirect our Christmas energy from individual charity to systemic justice. The Victorian Christmas taught us to donate toys to poor children and feel virtuous. But toys do not change the systems that create poverty. What if instead of performing Victorian charity, we supported policies and organisations that actually address root causes? What if our Christmas tradition became supporting living wages rather than giving food baskets? Supporting affordable housing rather than donating blankets? Supporting universal health care rather than paying for one family's medical bills? Supporting quality public education rather than buying school supplies for underfunded classrooms? Individual charity is not bad, but it is not enough. And when it becomes a substitute for justice, when it becomes a way to feel good while accepting injustice, it becomes exactly what the Victorians designed it to be. A performance that maintains inequality. We can do better. We can use the energy and resources we devote to Christmas charity and channel them toward actual change. That is how we reclaim Christmas from its Victorian purpose. Third, we can expand our circle of concern beyond one day. The Victorian Christmas taught us that generosity at Christmas absolved us of responsibility the rest of the year. We can reject that temporal separation. We can practice consistent compassion rather than seasonal sentiment. What if the kindness we show at Christmas became our baseline? What if we treated December 26th with the same generosity as December 25th? What if Christmas became not a special exception, but a reminder of how we should always be? This is not about being perfect. It is about being intentional, about recognizing when we are falling into Victorian patterns and choosing differently, about making our daily lives match our Christmas values rather than making Christmas a brief escape from our daily lives. Fourth, we can celebrate differently. The Victorian Christmas was about excess, about demonstrating wealth and status, about the biggest tree, the most elaborate feast, the most expensive gifts. We can choose simplicity instead. We can make Christmas about connection rather than consumption, about time together rather than things acquired, about experiences shared rather than possessions displayed. This is not about deprivation. It is about redirection. Taking the money and time and energy we would spend on Victorian-style excess and spending it on what actually brings joy, time with loved ones, experiences that create memories, giving that changes lives rather than clutters homes. Some of the happiest Christmases I've researched were not the elaborate Victorian feasts. They were the simple celebrations, the families who had little but shared what they had, the communities that gathered together, the moments of genuine connection that happened despite poverty, not because of wealth. We can learn from that. We can create Christmases that are rich in meaning even if they are simple in execution. That is how we separate Christmas from Victorian values of display and status. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, we can remember the invisible people. The Victorian Christmas worked because the labour that made it possible remained invisible. The servants, the chimney sweeps, the factory workers, the agricultural labourers, all invisible, all forgotten. We can choose to see them. When we buy Christmas gifts, we can think about who made them and under what conditions. When we eat Christmas dinner, we can think about who grew and harvested and transported that food. When we enjoy our warm, comfortable homes, we can think about who cleans them and maintains them and makes that comfort possible. And then we can act on that awareness. We can choose to support businesses that treat workers fairly. We can tip generously. We can thank people whose labour we benefit from. We can advocate for better working conditions and fair wages. We can refuse to participate in the Victorian habit of enjoying comfort while ignoring the people who create it. Seeing the invisible people is how we begin to dismantle the Victorian Christmas structure, because that structure depended on not seeing, on enjoying the celebration without confronting its cost. When we see, when we acknowledge, when we act on that acknowledgement, we break the mechanism. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds exhausting. This sounds like it takes all the joy out of Christmas. This sounds like we cannot just enjoy the holiday without analysing every aspect of it. And I hear that. I do. But here is what I have found. When you celebrate with your eyes open, when you practice justice instead of just charity, when you focus on connection instead of consumption, when you see and honour the invisible people, Christmas does not become less joyful. It becomes more joyful, because it becomes more honest, more meaningful, more aligned with what Christmas is supposed to be about. Peace on earth, goodwill toward all. These are not Victorian inventions. These are ancient hopes, universal longings. The Victorians did not create these ideals. They just performed them while violating them. We can actually practice them. We can create a Christmas that is genuinely about peace. Not the false peace of accepting inequality, but the real peace of working toward justice. Not the performative peace of one day of niceness, but the difficult peace of consistent compassion. We can create a Christmas that is genuinely about goodwill toward all, not the selective goodwill that extends to those we choose to help through charity, but the universal goodwill that demands justice for everyone, not the conditional goodwill that is withdrawn when people stop being grateful, but the unconditional goodwill that recognizes human dignity regardless of circumstance. This is the Christmas we can create. Not by returning to some imaginary pure past, because that past never existed. Not by rejecting Christmas entirely, because celebration and tradition matter, but by taking what the Victorians built and transforming it, by keeping the joy and discarding the injustice, by honouring the truth while creating something better. The Victorian Christmas was built on a lie, the lie that individual charity is enough, the lie that feeling generous is the same as being just, the lie that we can celebrate abundance while accepting scarcity for others, the lie that one day of kindness excuses 364 days of exploitation. We do not have to accept that lie anymore. We know better now. We know the history. We know the mechanisms. We know how Victorian Christmas was designed and what it was designed to do. And knowing that, we can choose differently. We can choose a Christmas that is honest about the past while hopeful about the future, that acknowledges the darkness while creating light, that sees the invisible people and works to make them visible, that practices justice instead of performing charity, that extends kindness beyond one day, that measures itself not by excess but by connection. That is genuinely about peace and goodwill, not just performing them. This is not easy. The Victorian Christmas is deeply embedded in our culture. Its mechanisms are everywhere. Its assumptions are baked into how we think about celebration and charity and kindness. Changing it requires constant awareness and deliberate choice, but it is possible. Every time you choose justice over charity, you're reclaiming Christmas. Every time you extend kindness beyond December 25th, you're transforming it. Every time you see and honour invisible labour, you're dismantling Victorian structures. Every time you celebrate with your eyes open, you are creating something new. And here is the beautiful irony. By rejecting Victorian values, we can create a Christmas that is actually closer to what Dickens claimed he wanted. A Christmas that genuinely cares for Tiny Tim, not through Scrooge's personal charity, but through a society that ensures no child goes without medical care. A Christmas that genuinely celebrates the Cratchit family, not by giving them one turkey, but by ensuring Bob Cratchit earns a living wage. A Christmas that genuinely transforms Scrooge, not just his individual generosity, but his understanding of economic justice. Dickens gave us the vision but not the mechanism. He showed us the dream but not the path. We can create that path. We can build the mechanism. We can make the Christmas that Dickens described, the one with actual peace and actual goodwill, not just performed sentiment. So this is my answer to the question. What do we do now that we know the truth about Victorian Christmas? We celebrate anyway, but we celebrate differently, with awareness, with intention, with commitment to justice, with eyes that see, with hearts that extend beyond one day, with actions that match our values. We take the beautiful parts, the gathering of loved ones, the creation of warmth in the dark of winter, the giving of gifts as expressions of love rather than demonstrations of wealth, the music and light and connection, the pause in our busy lives to appreciate what matters. These parts are real. These parts are valuable. These parts we can keep. And we leave behind the Victorian parts, the performance over substance, the charity that substitutes for justice, the one day of kindness excusing the rest, the invisible labour, the exploitation wrapped in sentiment, the use of celebration as social control. These parts we can abandon. These parts we should abandon. The Victorian Christmas is not sacred. It was invented by humans with specific purposes, many of them problematic. It can be reinvented by humans with better purposes. That work of reinvention is ours. That is what we do with this knowledge. We've spent 2 hours together examining Victorian Christmas, seeing its beauty and its brutality, understanding its genius and its cruelty, learning its history and its mechanisms, and now you know. You cannot unknow it, but that knowledge is not a burden. It is a gift. It is the gift of choice. The choice to celebrate with eyes open, the choice to create meaning without exploitation, the choice to practice what we preach, the choice to make Christmas actually about peace and goodwill, not just sentiment and performance. The Victorians gave us Christmas, but they do not own it anymore. We do. And we can make it mean something better, something truer, something more just, something that actually embodies the ideals it claims rather than performing them while violating them. That is the real Christmas transformation. Not Scrooge becoming personally generous while maintaining an unjust economic system, but all of us becoming collectively committed to creating a just society. Not one day of charity making us feel good, but every day of action making the world better. This is possible. It is happening. Every person who chooses awareness over ignorance, justice over charity, consistency over seasonal sentiment, they are creating a new Christmas. A post-Victorian Christmas. A Christmas that honours the truth of history while creating a better future. And that brings me to the end of this journey we have taken together. Thank you for staying with me through 12 parts and 2 hours of difficult truths and uncomfortable revelations. Thank you for being willing to look at Victorian Christmas with honest eyes. Thank you for caring enough to know the real story, not just the pretty version. I hope this series has changed how you see Christmas. I hope it has given you knowledge that matters. I hope it has inspired you to celebrate differently, to think critically, to see the invisible, to practice justice. But more than that, I hope this series has shown you that history matters. That understanding how we got here helps us choose where we go next. That knowing the truth about beloved traditions does not destroy them. It transforms them. It gives us the power to keep what is good and change what is not. The Victorian Christmas is just one example. One case study in how humans create culture, how power shapes tradition, how celebration can serve both connection and control. There are dozens of other stories like this, other traditions with hidden histories, other celebrations with uncomfortable truths, other cultural practices that seem innocent but serve specific purposes, and I will be here to explore them with you. Because this is what I do. I take the stories we think we know and show you what they really are. I find the uncomfortable truths hiding in our comfortable traditions. I illuminate the invisible. I question the accepted. I dig until I find the real story. So if you have found value in this exploration of Victorian Christmas, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, because there are more stories waiting, more histories to uncover, more truths to illuminate, more journeys we can take together into the fascinating, complicated, often troubling reality of human culture and tradition. The Victorian Christmas was not what you thought it was. Neither is a lot of other things, and I am going to show you, one story at a time, one revelation at a time, one uncomfortable truth at a time. Until then, celebrate your Christmas however feels right to you. But celebrate it with your eyes open. Celebrate it with knowledge. Celebrate it with intention. Celebrate it knowing the full story, the real history, the complete truth. And when you gather with loved ones, when you exchange gifts, when you light your tree, when you feel that warm glow of Christmas joy, remember the children in the chimneys. Remember the families in the workhouses. Remember the servants who worked while others celebrated. Remember the invisible people whose labour made it all possible. Not to feel guilty, not to stop celebrating, but to celebrate better, to celebrate with justice, to celebrate in ways that honour everyone, visible and invisible, wealthy and poor, past and present. That is how we transform Victorian Christmas into something worthy of what it claims to be. That is how we make peace and goodwill real instead of performed. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I will see you in the next story, and trust me, it will be worth the wait. Until then, stay curious, stay critical, stay compassionate, and never stop questioning the stories you've been told. Merry Christmas, the real one, the honest one, the one we are still creating.